Hello and welcome to Hidden Dusk, a place where the night grows quiet and the shadows begin to tell their stories. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable and relax. And if you enjoy calm and eerie stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let the darkness guide you into tonight's story. I've always been a huge fan of horror movies, ghost hunting shows, and anything paranormal. If my neighbor ever told me her house was haunted, I'd be the first to go check it out. I've always been fascinated by ghosts and the unknown. No horror movie ever fazed me, though The Exorcist came close. I used to imagine what it would be like to have a ghostly experience of my own. But after the last 8 months, I'm no longer curious. The events in my home have convinced me we're not alone. This past December, my family moved into my grandparents' old apartment, right upstairs from my parents in a 2-family home. My grandparents passed away years ago, peacefully within 2 years of each other, and since then, the upstairs was mostly rented out in the summer to close friends. Growing up in the downstairs unit, I never experienced anything that would make me think the place was haunted. But now everything feels different. It started with subtle things. We usually fall asleep with the bedroom TV on, and it began to turn off by itself. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up soon after falling asleep to find it off, while my husband was sound asleep beside me. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an old TV in an old house. This became the only regular oddity until summer came. As the weather warmed up, activity picked up. The dining room light began flickering each night as it got later. One night, as my husband was getting ready for bed, he turned off the living room TV, then went to switch off the dining room light. The moment he did, the TV turned back on. When he went back to turn off the TV, the dining room light shut off on its own. This got me wondering if maybe a ghost had been turning off the TV in our room all along. My husband also noticed that his phone, which he'd leave near the TV, was always dead by morning. We assumed the battery was bad until he moved it to a different spot one night, and the battery was fine the next day. Then, one night, I felt the bed shift as though my husband had gotten up, but when I looked over, he was sound asleep. The same thing happened later that night, and I began having trouble sleeping, always on edge about what might happen next. Another evening, while my husband and I were watching TV in the living room, I caught a shadow moving across my daughter's bedroom doorway, which I could see reflected in the dining room window. I felt a surge of anxiety and grabbed my husband's arm to quietly tell him what I'd seen, when my daughter suddenly yelled for me. She told me she'd seen a statue and wanted to stay with me. I reassured her, saying she was safe, but since I knew exactly what she meant, I stayed with her until she fell asleep. Over time, our sleeping arrangement became less conventional. My daughter needed me to help her fall asleep, so I often stayed in her room with her. My husband would sometimes sleep on her couch to help with his back. But the spirit didn't seem to like this arrangement. Activity only escalated from here. My husband and I began waking up to strange noises every night. Sometimes it was a knock. More often, footsteps in the room next to our bed. I've lived in this house long enough to know the difference between settling sounds and footsteps, and these were definitely footsteps. One night, I nearly stopped breathing when I woke up to find my daughter's mattress shaking, as though someone was pushing it. Another time, footsteps were followed by a rapping sound on the floor, almost like a loud knocking. To make it stranger, it seemed to come from near her ride-on pony toy, which makes no sound. It felt almost like a dark joke. While watching TV in the living room, my husband and I have seen and heard other things. During a heat wave, I hung a curtain between the dining room and kitchen to keep the cool air in. One evening, I watched as the curtain looked like someone was trying to pull it open, but there was no one there. My husband once saw a smoky figure zip from the bathroom to the kitchen before vanishing. One night, my daughter ended up in bed with us because I was too tired to tuck her in again. She suddenly sat up and screamed, "Who's that?" and pointed toward a corner of the room. I immediately heard footsteps coming from the same spot. Terrified us all. She eventually fell asleep, but my husband and I lay there, wide awake, and kept hearing soft, deliberate footsteps. Around 12:30 a.m., we moved to the couch, hoping to get some sleep. My daughter soon woke up and squeezed in with us. We were lying there when we suddenly heard heavy, fast footsteps coming from the kitchen, moving into the dining room and heading toward us. Time seemed to freeze. We looked at each other, certain we were about to see something. Someone. Just as the steps reached the doorway, I jumped off the couch, opened the front door, ready to grab my daughter and head downstairs to my parents. Thankfully, nothing appeared, but we were left shaken. That was just 2 nights ago, and it's the last major incident. The only thing that seems to bring us some peace is when I pray before bed. Some people laugh when I tell them this, but it's the only thing that helps us get a full night's sleep. I've always loved horror movies, but now I avoid them, knowing they'll just make me anxious and keep me up, waiting for something else to happen. Part of me wonders if my grandparents are trying to reach out, maybe even tell me something. They were kind, though, and I can't see them scaring us or our daughter. I've resisted the idea, but I'm considering visiting a psychic. I feel like I need to understand what's happening here and find a way to make it stop. My name is Alicia, and I live in Massachusetts. Since I was 3 months old, I've experienced paranormal activity, and I'm hoping that by sharing my story here, someone might be able to give me some insight into what's been happening. I tend to remember things vividly, so these experiences might seem detailed. My family and I lived in a small, peaceful town where crime was rare. For the first few years, everything in our home was calm. But when I was 6, things began to change, starting with a strange experience in late January. I had a nightlight on as I slept, and one night, I thought I heard whispering. I assumed it was my parents in the hallway, as I slept with my door open. But when I sat up, I saw a small shadow in the far corner by the door leading to our porch. Since the door was covered by shades, I knew it couldn't be anyone outside. I tried to see more clearly, and that's when I noticed a little girl older than I was at the time, maybe around 10. She had shoulder-length brownish hair and very dark eyes, and she wore an old-fashioned nightdress, shadowy and faded. The moment I focused on her face, she seemed to vanish. After that night, I often heard faint whispers, but I could never make out the words. When I turned 7, we got our first family pet, a guinea pig. Even though he wasn't like a dog or cat, I was very attached to him. The whispers continued, and whenever I heard them, he seemed to get restless. One night, he was more agitated than usual. I got up to calm him, but I froze when I heard a deep, male voice say, "Leave me alone." The room turned cold, and as I turned around, I saw a man standing in the opposite corner of my room, near my mother's closet. He seemed to be in his late 50s, with graying hair, dressed in dark, heavy clothing like a winter coat. His eyes were extremely dark and sent chills through me. I wanted to call out for help, but he disappeared before I could speak. That was the last time I saw or heard from him for several years. A month before my 9th birthday, we got a new pet, a cat. Since I wasn't fond of cats, my parents put a canopy over my bed to keep her from jumping up while I slept. Over the next year or so, I saw the little girl several more times. Each time, my guinea pig would get anxious whenever she appeared. When I was 10, I traveled overseas to Germany for the summer. About a week before returning, I received the sad news that my guinea pig had passed away from an infection. I didn't know much about animal health back then, so I accepted it, although I was heartbroken. That night, I distinctly heard the little girl's laughter. It felt almost comforting, as if she understood my sadness. At 11, I remember waking up early one morning around 4 a.m. and seeing a man in his mid-30s standing by my bed. He had a soft yellow glow and a gentle smile. There was nothing threatening about him, and I felt calm. But when I was 12, something truly terrifying happened, something that stayed with me ever since. I was lying in bed, with the light still dimly on, and I heard breathing nearby. I didn't think much of it. I'd gotten used to strange occurrences by then. But when my light started to dim, I assumed the bulb was going out. I was about to get my dad to replace it when I froze. Shadows were gathering around my bed, slowly closing in. Fear paralyzed me. I pulled the blanket over my head, leaving a small hole to peek through. Then I saw a small bluish light hovering above me, growing brighter until I had to shield my eyes. My ears started ringing, and then everything stopped. When I looked again, the shadows and light were gone. I've always felt that it was the spirit of my guinea pig, whom we'd buried just outside my bedroom window. For the remainder of our time in that house, I still heard whispers but never saw any entities again. This February, we moved to a nearby town into an apartment. For the first 2 months, everything was peaceful, and I hoped that was the end of the paranormal activity. But recently, I've started waking up at night to see a shadowy figure in the corner. A very old woman with gray hair who seems to be in her late 60s or early 70s. She doesn't move or speak. She just breathes heavily, as if she has trouble catching her breath. Curious, I reached out to my second cousin Jeff, hoping to learn more about our family history. Jeff told me about our Uncle Tommy, whom some of my other cousins have also seen. Uncle Tommy, Jeff explained, had passed away around 4 in the morning in his mid-30s, and he was often described as having a slight yellow glow, exactly like the man I saw when I was 11. Knowing that I'm not the only one in the family who's seen him is both comforting and a little unsettling. As for the little girl, the older man, and the elderly woman, I still don't know who they are or why they've chosen to visit me. I'm hoping that by sharing this story, someone might be able to offer me some guidance or insight. In the early 1970s, my parents bought their first home, a split-level entry house in a new neighborhood outside of Boston. The basement was unfinished, with a small room my dad called the mud room, to the left of the staircase. On the other side of the staircase, there was a larger storage area filled with unpacked boxes. At 5 years old, I remember sitting at my little table in the mud room, coloring, when I heard noises like someone moving boxes in the storage area. Even as a child, I sensed that someone or something was in there, but instead of fear, I felt curious. I called out, "I can hear you. I know you're in there." The sounds would pause briefly, then start up again. One weekend, my parents hired a babysitter, and my sister and I were jumping on their bed, something we'd never be allowed to do if they were home. We'd shut the bedroom door when suddenly the doorknob started turning, like someone was about to come in but then stopped. We rushed out, expecting to find the sitter playing a trick on us, but she was at the other end of the house, reading a magazine, insisting she hadn't moved. My sister doesn't remember this now, but it's clear as day to me. On another night, a loud crashing noise came from the basement. My dad went down to check but found nothing out of place. Another time, I woke up to what sounded like someone using a handsaw. Our dog, sleeping at the foot of my bed, was growling, his hackles up. I called out to my dad, and the sound instantly stopped. Once again, he found nothing. My bedroom door had always been a source of comfort, as I could see the glow of the hall light from bed. But one night, I woke up with an unsettling feeling. The door was slightly closed, blocking the light. Summoning my courage, I crawled to the end of the bed and tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I checked for toys or anything blocking it. Nothing was there. Panicked, I scrambled back under the covers. The next morning, the door moved freely as usual. The spirit, or whatever it was, seemed to enjoy toying with electronics. As I got older and moved into my own room, I often woke up to find my bedside lamp switched on, even though I hadn't turned it on. My dad once gave me a tape recorder, and one night as I was going to bed, I heard a strange sound. The recorder seemed to be jammed, with the buttons partially depressed as though someone had tried to use it. One day, I took a book from my sister's room, where the door incident had happened, and went back later to return it. Suddenly, I heard a scratching noise behind me. The small record player in the room had somehow turned on, with the needle scratching against the plastic turntable. Oddly, it had been set to 78 revolutions per minute, though we only had 45 revolutions per minute records. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying one of my sisters had probably been playing with it earlier. But they hadn't been home that afternoon. One summer night after a family outing, I went to bed and heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside. With the windows open, I could hear them clearly, as though someone was walking on gravel in the driveway. I got up to check, but the sound stopped. Even after I closed the windows, I could still hear the footsteps, along with a sound like a wooden ruler dropping onto a hard surface. Our dog sensed it too, pacing around the kitchen, whining and growling. My dad brushed it off as neighborhood kids, but I knew better. The hallway floorboards would often creak at night, and while I discovered a way to recreate the sound by stepping on certain areas, it still unnerved me as a child. One afternoon in 3rd grade, I was heading down to the basement and saw the outline of a tall, featureless man moving toward me. I froze, shutting my eyes as he passed through me. Later, while sitting on our front steps, I saw the same figure outlined against the chimney of the house across the street. The shadow started small and expanded to an impossible size. I ran inside to tell my mom, but she didn't seem to believe me. Now, here's where things get especially strange. One November morning, my dad sent me to the basement to get something from the freezer in the mudroom. In the middle of the floor lay a small, white human tooth, an incisor. At our ages, losing a tooth was a big deal, as it meant money from the tooth fairy. But no one in the family knew why the tooth was there. We even asked friends, but no one had lost a tooth recently. A year later, almost exactly, I found another incisor in the same spot. Again, no one knew where it came from. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but it still makes me uneasy when I think about it. As we got older, the creaks and bangs around the house seemed to increase. One summer, we were playing hide and seek with friends, and I hid in the closet in my sister's room. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the attic above. Terrified, I ran out and called everyone outside. When I explained, they thought I was imagining things, but they followed me inside, and we all stood there, listening. The footsteps started again, and we panicked, rushing for the stairs. Just as we reached the kitchen, the old rotary dial phone on the wall came loose, swinging with the line still attached. We bolted down the stairs in a frenzy, even tripping over each other, and waited outside until my mom came home. That's most of what I remember from the house. My dad and I talk about it sometimes, and he's shared some of his own experiences. He'd often wake up in the middle of the night to hear his name called. Specifically, a childhood nickname no one else used anymore. Once, he woke up to see a child standing by his bed. Thinking it was one of us, he reached out, but his hand felt nothing but ice-cold air, and the figure vanished. When I asked my dad why he always made me sleep in my own bed despite my fears, he said he thought I needed to face them. I eventually learned to ignore the sounds, realizing that my fear seemed to make the activity worse. So, here's my question. Could this have been poltergeist activity, given that my sisters and I were preteens? We checked into the property's history and found that the land had once been woods. We found arrowheads and old horseshoes in the area, and the Assabet River ran nearby, alongside an old dump from the early 1900s. We'd often find charred items, and there had been a massive fire in the area in the early 1900s. Could the fire or the items we found be tied to these strange experiences? My family and I recently moved into a new house. It's an old house built in the 70s, and after years in an apartment, my kids were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. But it quickly became clear that we weren't the only ones living there. On another night, a loud crashing noise came from the basement. My dad went down to check but found nothing out of place. Another time, I woke up to what sounded like someone using a handsaw. Our dog, sleeping at the foot of my bed, was growling, his hackles up. I called out to my dad, and the sound instantly stopped. Once again, he found nothing. My bedroom door had always been a source of comfort, as I could see the glow of the hall light from bed. But one night, I woke up with an unsettling feeling. The door was slightly closed, blocking the light. Summoning my courage, I crawled to the end of the bed and tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I checked for toys or anything blocking it. Nothing was there. Panicked, I scrambled back under the covers. The next morning, the door moved freely as usual. The spirit, or whatever it was, seemed to enjoy toying with electronics. As I got older and moved into my own room, I often woke up to find my bedside lamp switched on, even though I hadn't turned it on. My dad once gave me a tape recorder, and one night as I was going to bed, I heard a strange sound. The recorder seemed to be jammed, with the buttons partially depressed as though someone had tried to use it. One day, I took a book from my sister's room, where the door incident had happened, and went back later to return it. Suddenly, I heard a scratching noise behind me. The small record player in the room had somehow turned on, with the needle scratching against the plastic turntable. Oddly, it had been set to 78 revolutions per minute, though we only had 45 revolutions per minute records. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying one of my sisters had probably been playing with it earlier. But they hadn't been home that afternoon. One summer night after a family outing, I went to bed and heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside. With the windows open, I could hear them clearly, as though someone was walking on gravel in the driveway. I got up to check, but the sound stopped. Even after I closed the windows, I could still hear the footsteps, along with a sound like a wooden ruler dropping onto a hard surface. Our dog sensed it too, pacing around the kitchen, whining and growling. My dad brushed it off as neighborhood kids, but I knew better. The hallway floorboards would often creak at night, and while I discovered a way to recreate the sound by stepping on certain areas, it still unnerved me as a child. One afternoon in 3rd grade, I was heading down to the basement and saw the outline of a tall, featureless man moving toward me. I froze, shutting my eyes as he passed through me. Later, while sitting on our front steps, I saw the same figure outlined against the chimney of the house across the street. The shadow started small and expanded to an impossible size. I ran inside to tell my mom, but she didn't seem to believe me. Now, here's where things get especially strange. One November morning, my dad sent me to the basement to get something from the freezer in the mudroom. In the middle of the floor lay a small, white human tooth, an incisor. At our ages, losing a tooth was a big deal, as it meant money from the tooth fairy. But no one in the family knew why the tooth was there. We even asked friends, but no one had lost a tooth recently. A year later, almost exactly, I found another incisor in the same spot. Again, no one knew where it came from. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but it still makes me uneasy when I think about it. As we got older, the creaks and bangs around the house seemed to increase. One summer, we were playing hide-and-seek with friends, and I hid in the closet in my sister's room. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the attic above. Terrified, I ran out and called everyone outside. When I explained, they thought I was imagining things, but they followed me inside, and we all stood there, listening. The footsteps started again, and we panicked, rushing for the stairs. Just as we reached the kitchen, the old rotary dial phone on the wall came loose, swinging with the line still attached. We bolted down the stairs in a frenzy, even tripping over each other, and waited outside until my mom came home. That's most of what I remember from the house. My dad and I talk about it sometimes, and he's shared some of his own experiences. He'd often wake up in the middle of the night to hear his name called. Specifically, a childhood nickname no one else used anymore. Once, he woke up to see a child standing by his bed. Thinking it was one of us, he reached out, but his hand felt nothing but ice-cold air, and the figure vanished. When I asked my dad why he always made me sleep in my own bed despite my fears, he said he thought I needed to face them. I eventually learned to ignore the sounds, realizing that my fear seemed to make the activity worse. So, here's my question. Could this have been poltergeist activity, given that my sisters and I were preteens? We checked into the property's history and found that the land had once been woods. We found arrowheads and old horseshoes in the area, and the Assabet River ran nearby, alongside an old dump from the early 1900s. We'd often find charred items, and there had been a massive fire in the area in the early 1900s. Could the fire or the items we found be tied to these strange experiences? My family and I recently moved into a new house. It's an old house built in the 70s, and after years in an apartment, my kids were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. But it quickly became clear that we weren't the only ones living there. My name is Alicia, and I live in Massachusetts. Since I was 3 months old, I've experienced paranormal activity, and I'm hoping that by sharing my story here, someone might be able to give me some insight into what's been happening. I tend to remember things vividly, so these experiences might seem detailed. My family and I lived in a small, peaceful town where crime was rare. For the first few years, everything in our home was calm. But when I was 6, things began to change, starting with a strange experience in late January. I had a nightlight on as I slept, and one night, I thought I heard whispering. I assumed it was my parents in the hallway, as I slept with my door open. But when I sat up, I saw a small shadow in the far corner by the door leading to our porch. Since the door was covered by shades, I knew it couldn't be anyone outside. I tried to see more clearly, and that's when I noticed a little girl, older than I was at the time, maybe around 10. She had shoulder-length brownish hair and very dark eyes, and she wore an old-fashioned nightdress, shadowy and faded. The moment I focused on her face, she seemed to vanish. After that night, I often heard faint whispers, but I could never make out the words. When I turned 7, we got our first family pet, a guinea pig. Even though he wasn't like a dog or cat, I was very attached to him. The whispers continued, and whenever I heard them, he seemed to get restless. One night, he was more agitated than usual. I got up to calm him, but I froze when I heard a deep, male voice say, "Leave me alone." The room turned cold, and as I turned around, I saw a man standing in the opposite corner of my room, near my mother's closet. He seemed to be in his late 50s, with graying hair, dressed in dark, heavy clothing like a winter coat. His eyes were extremely dark and sent chills through me. I wanted to call out for help, but he disappeared before I could speak. That was the last time I saw or heard from him for several years. A month before my 9th birthday, we got a new pet, a cat. Since I wasn't fond of cats, my parents put a canopy over my bed to keep her from jumping up while I slept. Over the next year or so, I saw the little girl several more times. Each time, my guinea pig would get anxious whenever she appeared. When I was 10, I traveled overseas to Germany for the summer. About a week before returning, I received the sad news that my guinea pig had passed away from an infection. I didn't know much about animal health back then, so I accepted it, although I was heartbroken. That night, I distinctly heard the little girl's laughter. It felt almost comforting, as if she understood my sadness. At 11, I remember waking up early one morning around 4 a.m. and seeing a man in his mid-30s standing by my bed. He had a soft yellow glow and a gentle smile. There was nothing threatening about him, and I felt calm. But when I was 12, something truly terrifying happened, something that stayed with me ever since. I was lying in bed, with the light still dimly on, and I heard breathing nearby. I didn't think much of it. I'd gotten used to strange occurrences by then. But when my light started to dim, I assumed the bulb was going out. I was about to get my dad to replace it when I froze. Shadows were gathering around my bed, slowly closing in. Fear paralyzed me. I pulled the blanket over my head, leaving a small hole to peek through. Then I saw a small bluish light hovering above me, growing brighter until I had to shield my eyes. My ears started ringing, and then everything stopped. When I looked again, the shadows and light were gone. I've always felt that it was the spirit of my guinea pig, whom we'd buried just outside my bedroom window. For the remainder of our time in that house, I still heard whispers but never saw any entities again. This February, we moved to a nearby town into an apartment. For the first 2 months, everything was peaceful, and I hoped that was the end of the paranormal activity. But recently, I've started waking up at night to see a shadowy figure in the corner. A very old woman with gray hair who seems to be in her late 60s or early 70s. She doesn't move or speak. She just breathes heavily, as if she has trouble catching her breath. Curious, I reached out to my second cousin Jeff, hoping to learn more about our family history. Jeff told me about our Uncle Tommy, whom some of my other cousins have also seen. Uncle Tommy, Jeff explained, had passed away around 4 in the morning in his mid-30s, and he was often described as having a slight yellow glow, exactly like the man I saw when I was 11. Knowing that I'm not the only one in the family who's seen him is both comforting and a little unsettling. As for the little girl, the older man, and the elderly woman, I still don't know who they are or why they've chosen to visit me. I'm hoping that by sharing this story, someone might be able to offer me some guidance or insight. In the early 1970s, my parents bought their first home, a split-level entry house in a new neighborhood outside of Boston. The basement was unfinished, with a small room my dad called the mud room, to the left of the staircase. On the other side of the staircase, there was a larger storage area filled with unpacked boxes. At 5 years old, I remember sitting at my little table in the mudroom, coloring, when I heard noises like someone moving boxes in the storage area. Even as a child, I sensed that someone or something was in there, but instead of fear, I felt curious. I called out, "I can hear you. I know you're in there." The sounds would pause briefly, then start up again. One weekend, my parents hired a babysitter, and my sister and I were jumping on their bed, something we'd never be allowed to do if they were home. We'd shut the bedroom door when suddenly the doorknob started turning, like someone was about to come in but then stopped. We rushed out, expecting to find the sitter playing a trick on us. But she was at the other end of the house, reading a magazine, insisting she hadn't moved. My sister doesn't remember this now, but it's clear as day to me. On another night, a loud crashing noise came from the basement. My dad went down to check but found nothing out of place. Another time, I woke up to what sounded like someone using a handsaw. Our dog, sleeping at the foot of my bed, was growling, his hackles up. I called out to my dad, and the sound instantly stopped. Once again, he found nothing. My bedroom door had always been a source of comfort, as I could see the glow of the hall light from bed. But one night, I woke up with an unsettling feeling. The door was slightly closed, blocking the light. Summoning my courage, I crawled to the end of the bed and tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I checked for toys or anything blocking it. Nothing was there. Panicked, I scrambled back under the covers. The next morning, the door moved freely as usual. The spirit, or whatever it was, seemed to enjoy toying with electronics. As I got older and moved into my own room, I often woke up to find my bedside lamp switched on, even though I hadn't turned it on. My dad once gave me a tape recorder, and one night as I was going to bed, I heard a strange sound. The recorder seemed to be jammed, with the buttons partially depressed as though someone had tried to use it. One day, I took a book from my sister's room, where the door incident had happened, and went back later to return it. Suddenly, I heard a scratching noise behind me. The small record player in the room had somehow turned on, with the needle scratching against the plastic turntable. Oddly, it had been set to 78 revolutions per minute, though we only had 45 revolutions per minute records. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying one of my sisters had probably been playing with it earlier. But they hadn't been home that afternoon. One summer night after a family outing, I went to bed and heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside. With the windows open, I could hear them clearly, as though someone was walking on gravel in the driveway. I got up to check, but the sound stopped. Even after I closed the windows, I could still hear the footsteps, along with a sound like a wooden ruler dropping onto a hard surface. Our dog sensed it too, pacing around the kitchen, whining and growling. My dad brushed it off as neighborhood kids, but I knew better. The hallway floorboards would often creak at night, and while I discovered a way to recreate the sound by stepping on certain areas, it still unnerved me as a child. One afternoon in 3rd grade, I was heading down to the basement and saw the outline of a tall, featureless man moving toward me. I froze, shutting my eyes as he passed through me. Later, while sitting on our front steps, I saw the same figure outlined against the chimney of the house across the street. The shadow started small and expanded to an impossible size. I ran inside to tell my mom, but she didn't seem to believe me. Now, here's where things get especially strange. One November morning, my dad sent me to the basement to get something from the freezer in the mudroom. In the middle of the floor lay a small, white human tooth, an incisor. At our ages, losing a tooth was a big deal, as it meant money from the tooth fairy. But no one in the family knew why the tooth was there. We even asked friends, but no one had lost a tooth recently. A year later, almost exactly, I found another incisor in the same spot. Again, no one knew where it came from. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but it still makes me uneasy when I think about it. As we got older, the creaks and bangs around the house seemed to increase. One summer, we were playing hide-and-seek with friends, and I hid in the closet in my sister's room. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the attic above. Terrified, I ran out and called everyone outside. When I explained, they thought I was imagining things, but they followed me inside, and we all stood there, listening. The footsteps started again, and we panicked, rushing for the stairs. Just as we reached the kitchen, the old rotary dial phone on the wall came loose, swinging with the line still attached. We bolted down the stairs in a frenzy, even tripping over each other, and waited outside until my mom came home. That's most of what I remember from the house. My dad and I talk about it sometimes, and he's shared some of his own experiences. He'd often wake up in the middle of the night to hear his name called. Specifically, a childhood nickname no one else used anymore. Once, he woke up to see a child standing by his bed. Thinking it was one of us, he reached out, but his hand felt nothing but ice-cold air, and the figure vanished. When I asked my dad why he always made me sleep in my own bed despite my fears, he said he thought I needed to face them. I eventually learned to ignore the sounds, realizing that my fear seemed to make the activity worse. So, here's my question. Could this have been poltergeist activity, given that my sisters and I were preteens? We checked into the property's history and found that the land had once been woods. We found arrowheads and old horseshoes in the area, and the Assabet River ran nearby, alongside an old dump from the early 1900s. We'd often find charred items, and there had been a massive fire in the area in the early 1900s. Could the fire or the items we found be tied to these strange experiences? My family and I recently moved into a new house. It's an old house built in the 70s, and after years in an apartment, my kids were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. But it quickly became clear that we weren't the only ones living there. On our very first night, my husband and I heard a loud banging noise downstairs. We brushed it off as normal house sounds and went back to sleep. But a few hours later, we heard a crash. My husband went down to check and found a vase had fallen off the table. We assumed it must have been a gust of wind, so we dismissed it and went back to bed. But that was only the beginning. The next day, when my son came home from school, he went into the living room and immediately screamed and ran out. I chuckled, thinking he'd just been startled by a bat or maybe a bird in the chimney. But his story was much different. He said he'd seen a man floating above the table. I went to check but saw nothing. My son was still shaking, insisting that he wasn't lying. Later that evening, as I was putting clothes away in my bedroom, I noticed it felt much colder than the rest of the house. I checked the thermostat. It read 70 degrees, but the room felt closer to 50. When I went back into the room, I froze. There, floating above my bed, was a man. He was tall, with a red beard and hair, and his eyes were just black holes. He appeared for a second, then disappeared as suddenly as he'd come. I stumbled down the stairs, picked up the phone, and dialed my husband's work number. When I told him what I'd seen, he just laughed, asking if I was overtired. His disbelief only made me more anxious. I decided to pack up the kids and head to my sister's house. I didn't want to stay in a house with a ghost. When we arrived at my sister's, I told her what had happened. She didn't believe me either, saying it was probably just stress from moving. We stayed overnight, but I knew I couldn't avoid the house forever. So, the next day, I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and went back home. I tried to stay calm, hoping to keep my kids from worrying. Once my husband and kids left for work and school, I was alone in the house. The weather was gloomy and rainy, which only made things feel more eerie. While washing dishes in the kitchen, I heard a loud bang in the dining room. When I went to check, I heard a smash behind me in the kitchen. I turned back to find plates, cups, and glasses shattered all over the floor. And then I saw him again. The ghost stared right at me, grinned, and said, "Get out." Terrified, I dashed out of the kitchen, grabbed my car keys, and drove off. I called my husband, insisting we had to move, but he reminded me how much we'd saved to buy this house and refused to consider it. Desperate, I drove to the church and spoke to the priest, explaining everything and asking if he could bless our house. He agreed to come by, and when we got there, he went from room to room, praying and sprinkling holy water throughout the house. Once he left, I felt a little bit better. It's been 2 days now, and we haven't seen any signs of the ghost. But deep down, I still feel his presence. I know he's still here, watching and waiting. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Oh. I've lived with my grandparents for as long as I can remember. My grandpa has several health issues, and there's always been an undercurrent of worry in the house. His parents, who were Italian, passed away in the 70s. Since the day he was first admitted to the hospital, strange things have started happening in our home. I've noticed that whenever I talk about these occurrences, even more things happen that night, making it nearly impossible to sleep. So, I'm bracing myself for a restless night after sharing this. At the top of our staircase, there's a plastic gate to keep my niece and nephew safe. One night, when it was just my grandma and me at home, we both heard the gate slam shut. Twice. But there were no footsteps on the stairs or in the hallway, which is unusual because those old stairs always creak, no matter how light-footed someone is. My grandmother thought I was asleep and didn't mention it until I asked, "Did you hear that?" We both felt uneasy, wondering if someone had broken in, but the silence told us otherwise. Another day, I was home alone working on some paperwork. When I glanced into the living room, I saw both my dogs lying down, one on the couch and the other on the floor, staring intently into the corner of the room where the fireplace is. Suddenly, their heads moved as if they were tracking something invisible, and the hair on their backs stood up. Just then, I saw a large black shadow or blob float from the living room into the room where I was sitting. It disappeared right by the seat next to me. I called my sister, practically in tears, but she thought I was just seeing things. Later, I told my grandma about what I'd seen, saying, "It was like someone's shadow, but no one was there to cast it." She surprised me by replying, "I've seen shadows around the house out of the corner of my eye, too."
That night, I was resting on the couch with a friend who'd fallen asleep. I glanced through the double doors into the kitchen and saw a large, misty white figure that looked like a woman in her 50s, dressed in a beautiful, flowing gown. But the moment I blinked, she was gone. I've since noticed more shadows, larger ones, more shadow-like than misty. The next day, I was taking a shower when I suddenly felt a sharp, burning pain on my arm. Looking down, I saw deep, bloody scratches, though there was nothing in the shower that could have caused them. Yesterday, I was looking through some old photos and found a picture of a couple that looked strangely familiar, especially the woman. Upon closer inspection, I realized she was the same misty figure I'd seen in the kitchen. I haven't worked up the nerve to ask my grandma who they are. And as I'm writing this, my dogs have huddled together in the corner of the room where my Nana's recliner sits. She passed away in March. The dogs started whimpering and shaking, and just as they began to bark, I caught a whiff of something unmistakable, my Nana's favorite perfume, Taboo. All her belongings, including that perfume, are stored in the attic. These experiences leave me with more questions than answers, and each day seems to add a new piece to this strange puzzle. I was 19 when I moved into an apartment that would soon change my mind about ghosts. I was in college with my best friend, Anna, and we decided to rent a place together to be closer and save money. We found an old house that fit our tight college budget. It was very old and a little rickety, but we didn't mind. Our downstairs neighbor, Sandy, was a strange older lady who never said hello and seemed to complain about everything. But we figured we could handle her quirks. As we settled in, we started feeling like we'd made a mistake. On windy nights, the house would sway and creak, making it feel like it could fall over at any moment. And the bats. They were everywhere, in the bathroom, on our lamps, even in the kitchen. I was beginning to hate the house. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard Anna scream. Assuming it was a bat, I grabbed a broom and rushed into her room. She was staring at the doorway, wide-eyed. I asked her where the bat was, but she just kept pointing, saying she'd seen a man standing there, watching her. At first, she'd thought it was me, but then she realized it wasn't. When she screamed, the figure disappeared. I tried to reassure her, saying she must have been imagining things, and encouraged her to get some sleep. A month later, Anna left for Florida to de-stress. I stayed back, alone in the house. Even Sandy, the neighbor, was away. On my first day alone, the power went out. I decided to check the basement for the circuit box, so I grabbed a flashlight and opened the basement door. It was pitch black. I cautiously went down the stairs, shining my flashlight in every direction, but instead of the circuit box, I found a well. A deep, ancient-looking well right in the basement. I shone my light down it, but I couldn't see the bottom. I tossed my lip gloss down, but there was no sound at all. As I backed away, I heard faint mumbling noises coming from the well itself. Panicked, I stumbled and crashed into things in the dark until I finally found the stairs and ran out of the basement. That night, I barely slept, and the next day, I called an electrician to fix the power. I wasn't about to go back down there. 3 days later, I had another strange experience. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps and low mumbling. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept for emergencies and crept downstairs, but the house was empty. I went back to bed, but the noises started up again. Frustrated, I checked outside, but there was no one there. As I returned to my room, I heard a massive crash, a sound so loud it felt like an explosion. Terrified, I raced downstairs, only to find Anna's entire bedroom had collapsed into the kitchen. Dust filled the air, and through the haze, I heard a deep, stern voice say one word: leave. I didn't wait to be told twice. I ran outside, jumped in my car, and drove straight to my parents' house. The next morning, I called Anna to tell her that her room had collapsed and she could have mine because I wasn't going back. When it was time to get my things, my parents, friends, and boyfriend helped pack up. I refused to step foot in that house again, convinced that whatever was there would hurt me if I did. I'm a pretty average 15-year-old guy from a small town in Massachusetts, but over the years, I've had some strange experiences with the paranormal. I thought I'd share them here and see what you guys think.
It all started when I was about 11, living with my mom in a small apartment. Not long after we moved in, we found out someone had committed suicide there. Weird things started happening pretty quickly. In our kitchen, we had a shelf where things would fall off daily. Anything from a loaf of bread to brownies, even flat items that seemed like they shouldn't fall. In my room, my TV had a habit of turning on by itself. I'd be playing a game, turn everything off, and head to the living room, only to see my TV switch back on as I was walking out. One event that really sticks with me happened one night when I was home alone. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was watching TV in my bed with my dog, a little Italian greyhound who's blind because of diabetes. My door was open, and out of nowhere, I heard footsteps coming right up to my door. My dog suddenly started barking nonstop for a solid 3 minutes. After I finally calmed him down, I felt this intense presence in the room, like someone was watching me. It freaked me out, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. Later, my mom and I hit some tough times and ended up moving in with my aunt. She has a good-sized house on a dead-end street, and it felt like the activity picked up even more after we moved in. I have my own room now, and my aunt also renovated the basement into a living room where I hang out a lot. Strange things mostly happen in the basement. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the recliner with my laptop, I'll feel a cold breeze on my cheek, even with the door shut and no draft. It's startling but doesn't feel threatening. I'll also see quick shadows darting around from the corner of my eye. Occasionally, I hear faint whispers, but I can't make out the words. This only happens once in a while, but it's unsettling. One evening, I was home alone around 7:30. It was completely quiet, no TVs on, nothing. I was lying in bed using my iPod with the sound off so it was dead silent. Suddenly, from behind me, I heard a loud, deep exhale, like, "Ho." It scared the life out of me. I went to the living room, turned on every light, and waited for someone to come home. The last incident, which actually happened today, was what finally pushed me to write this post. Diagonally across the street from my aunt's house, my cousin, or her daughter, who's about 29, bought a house that had been up for sale. My aunts lived here for over 20 years, so we know some history about the place. An old man named Walter, who was known to be a bit odd, lived there before he died about 5 years ago in his 70s. After he passed, a mother and daughter moved in. The daughter, who was around 25, acted really strange. She once threw a sewing basket into our basketball hoop for no reason. We later found out she had schizophrenia, which might explain some of her behavior, but I'm not sure if it's related to what happened next. Anyway, There was nothing to drink in my house today, so I decided to run over to my cousin's place for a Coke. It's a safe neighborhood, so they usually leave the door unlocked. I went in, grabbed a Coke from the fridge, and that's when I heard it whistling. It sounded like someone whistling inside the house, and it kept getting louder. I freaked out, slammed the fridge shut, and bolted. The strangest part was that even as I ran, the whistling stayed just as loud, almost like it was following me. I could still hear it faintly outside, as if it didn't fade with the distance. In the summer of 2002, my ex-husband and I went on a long-awaited vacation to Salem, Massachusetts. I was thrilled to finally explore one of the most historic and haunted cities in America. We checked into the carriage house in B&B, where I immediately grabbed a stack of brochures and began mapping out ghost tours and historical sites I wanted to visit. One of the tours started at the Peabody Essex Museum, leading to outdoor sites tied to Salem's 18th and 19th century maritime history. It was a beautiful summer day when we set off on the Peabody tour. One of our stops was the Gardner Pingree House. Our guide went ahead to check if we could enter, as repairs were underway. When he returned, he looked puzzled and mentioned that while the workers' tools were in the front room, the house seemed empty. With a sarcastic smile, he said, "Nice of them to lock up." Inside, we admired the antique furniture and the fireplace with its cauldron-style pots and old cooking utensils hanging nearby. The guide began sharing the story of Captain Joseph White, the home's original owner. Captain White had been a wealthy sea captain known for his love of parties, drinking, and his risky habit of storing his gold and doubloons in a trunk in his bedroom. When back from voyages, he'd sometimes let slip to strangers that he kept money in the house. As the guide led us upstairs to the captain's bedroom, he continued the story. One night, the captain, who was in his 80s, retired early, possibly feeling unwell. The next morning, his son, Benjamin White, discovered a ground-floor window open with a plank leaning against it. Fearing they'd been robbed, he ran upstairs to find his father bludgeoned to death in his bed. I was so absorbed in the guide's story that I nearly jumped when I heard the front door slam. The guide paused, then muttered, "Looks like the workers are back from lunch." Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the staircase, like someone in work boots heading upstairs. Irritated, the guide said, "What is with these people today? They know they're not supposed to come upstairs during a tour." Curious, I poked my head out of the bedroom to see who was coming up, but as soon as I did, the footsteps stopped. No one was there. The guide called out, but there was no reply. Silence fell over the group as we all exchanged uneasy glances. I turned to my ex-husband and said, "I think the captain is home." Right after I said that, a chill ran through the room, and the hair on my arms stood on end. Looking visibly shaken, the guide turned pale and abruptly announced, "Tour's over." He practically sprinted down the stairs with everyone in the group following close behind, rushing out the door. I couldn't believe it. I'd actually had a paranormal experience in Salem, Massachusetts. It's a memory I'll never forget, and I can't wait for the chance to go back again. A couple of weeks ago, my cousin, his friend, and I took our kayaks out for a day of fishing and relaxing. It was early spring, our first time out for the year, something my cousin and I have done almost weekly over the past few years whenever the weather was nice. This time we were on Great Island Pond, named for the 2-acre island located in the middle. On this island, there's an abandoned hunting lodge. Locals say it was used up until sometime in the 1970s. Though the area now has new neighborhoods and housing developments, back then, it was a remote, isolated place. My cousin and I usually stop by the lodge and walk through it during each kayaking trip, so we know the layout well. It's a large house with 3 floors and a wraparound deck on the second floor that offers a beautiful view of the pond and surrounding woods. We guided our friend, who was new to kayaking and had never been to the lodge, through the layout, telling him where to step and where not to step. Not 10 seconds after we entered the kitchen, we heard loud, heavy footsteps upstairs. It sounded like someone walking, or maybe a large animal. The footsteps were too loud to be a squirrel or raccoon, so we all paused, listening. A bit freaked out, we shrugged it off, playing it cool as 3 guys in their 20s. We walked through the parlor to the front deck to show our friend the view. As we passed through, my cousin and I both stopped, glancing at each other. He asked me exactly what I'd been about to ask him. Why is the door to upstairs closed? The door had always been open on all our previous visits, so it stood out to us immediately. Since there's no wind in the house, all the doors are always closed. There was no reason for the door to be shut. We moved on, though, spending a few minutes outside taking in the view and snapping a few pictures. When we headed back inside, we walked through the parlor again, and that's when it happened. The closed door to the upstairs flung open with a force that left a dent in the wall. We didn't waste a second. All three of us bolted out of the house into the front yard, visibly shaken and trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no wind, no other doors open, and we'd seen that the door was latched shut when we first noticed it. After 5 minutes of debate, we decided to go back in. We went upstairs, but there was nothing. No frightened animal or any sign of what could have caused the door to burst open like that. We were completely dumbfounded. It was a very confusing and memorable stop during an otherwise relaxing day. Another strange experience happened more recently when I was lying in bed, unable to fall asleep. For some reason, I felt compelled to open my eyes, something I don't usually do when trying to sleep. Directly above me on the ceiling was a swirling, misty pattern. It was mostly black but had traces of color, and it was shifting around in one general area. I had a strange sensation in my body as I watched it, feeling like something wasn't quite right. Thinking maybe I was seeing things, I woke my girlfriend and asked if she could see it too. But she couldn't. I looked back, and the mist was still there, slowly moving. Eventually, I just closed my eyes, and at some point, I fell asleep. I haven't thought much about it until now. Both of these experiences have left me with more questions than answers, and I'm still trying to figure out if there's an explanation, or if something unexplainable might really be going on. I'm a 27-year-old living in Boston, Massachusetts, but my story starts in a Boston suburb around 1991 when I was about 8. A few years after my parents divorced, I started questioning my faith, which I now realize was unusual for someone my age. I'd say things like, I never asked Jesus to die for me, and why is this religion the right one when there are so many in the world? I didn't understand why I felt these doubts, but they seemed to mark the beginning of some very strange experiences. Around that time, I started having recurring experiences that, to this day, I'm not sure were dreams or something more. Some mornings, I'd feel as though I'd already gotten up, dressed, and walked to school. I'd see everything exactly as it was, walking across the field, reaching the crossing guard, and heading toward the school. But just as I arrived, I'd snap back to my body, still lying in bed, not waking up, but suddenly aware I hadn't actually gone anywhere. It was as if I'd been somewhere outside myself. But more disturbing were the episodes of pure terror. One day, as I walked through our kitchen, an overwhelming sense of fear gripped me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or call out. I remember being surrounded by what looked like black, writhing shapes wrapping around my arms and legs. I described them as snakes or eels for their shape, but they weren't solid. They were like formless black shadows holding me in place. I sensed there was more than one of them, but I can't say exactly how many. I don't know if the fear started before these dreams, or if they happened at the same time. But since then, I've stayed away from anything religious or spiritual. Over the years, I've struggled with a short temper, deep-seated anger, and persistent depression. Only recently have I started to think back on these experiences, but doing so seems to have made everything worse. I've been plagued by even more intense feelings of depression, anger, and anxiety. In desperation, I recently started praying sincerely, asking for protection. But now, I feel an unsettling presence, like an angry man breathing down my neck whenever I'm alone. It's the same fear I had as a child, though now it doesn't paralyze me. One night, I was so terrified that I stayed awake until the sun was up. Thinking daylight would keep me safe, I decided to shower. Just as I was starting to relax, my Venetian blinds suddenly flew off the window. My roommate and I checked to see if they'd been improperly installed, but we both agreed they had been securely in place, and in all the time we'd lived there, they'd never fallen off before. I want to know more about these experiences. I know I should keep praying and focus on protection, but a part of me is deeply curious about what happened when I was young, and what may still be happening now. I wonder if I could undergo hypnosis to see more clearly whatever it was that gripped me as a child. I'd really like to hear from others who've experienced similar things. Astral projections, encounters with an entity of pure terror, or inexplicable feelings of depression and anger. I feel like I'm a good person at heart, but something has haunted me for most of my life, and I'm just now ready to face it. My name is Jean. I'm a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. I've been married for 33 years and take care of a mentally challenged man 7 days a week. This is my true ghost story. In 1975, I was 28 years old, living in Dorchester, Massachusetts with my husband and our 3 young children. We just moved into the top floor of a 3-decker apartment building. For the first 2 months, life was normal. My husband would go to work, the older kids would go to school, and I'd stay home with the baby. One night, just after midnight, I was lying awake in bed. My husband was fast asleep next to me. As I tried to drift off, I heard faint voices, as though someone was talking quietly. I could make out the voice of a man, and it sounded like he was describing an apartment, almost like a landlord showing someone around. I assumed it was coming from downstairs, but as I turned over, I saw him. Standing in the doorway, holding the doorknob, was a man, as clear as day. He looked like an older gentleman, heavy-set, with gray hair and rosy cheeks. He gave off a jolly presence, as if he was just checking in. I blinked, wiped my eyes, and when I looked again, he was gone. Oddly, I wasn't scared. The next morning, I told my husband what I'd seen, but he just laughed it off. Later, I went to visit my mother-in-law and mentioned the man I'd seen. She went pale and told me that the description matched the previous landlord, Mr. Tate, who had passed away a few months before we moved in. She explained that he was known for being a jolly, heavy-set man with gray hair and rosy cheeks. That sent chills down my spine, but still, I didn't feel afraid. Not long after, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of the baby crying. I went to get him, made a bottle, and sat down on the edge of the bed to feed him. My husband was asleep, and as I settled in, I reached for a cigarette. I know, holding a baby and smoking. Different times, right? Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me say, "Jean, don't smoke between 2 and 4 a.m. This time I was shaken. I quickly put the cigarette out and continued feeding the baby, trying to ignore it. The next morning, my husband admitted he'd had a strange experience too. He'd felt something tugging at his hair in bed and thought he heard someone talking about numbers. When he looked over, I was sound asleep. "Do you believe me now?" I asked him. Over the next few days, little things began to happen. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen and noticed the lamp in the living room was off. I went in to check it, and when I turned the switch, it flicked back on. I shrugged it off, assuming I'd forgotten to turn it on. But just a few minutes later, it was off again. I checked, and the switch was in the off position, even though I just turned it on. That's when I began talking to whoever or whatever was there, asking them not to scare the kids.
One evening, we were having dinner when a loud bang came from the dryer, as though someone had hit it hard. My husband and I looked at each other with wide eyes. I said aloud, "Okay, we know you're here. You don't have to bang on things. You're scaring the kids." After that, things calmed down for a few weeks. Then one Saturday afternoon, the power went out while I was blow-drying my hair. I assumed it was a power outage, but then I noticed the TV in the kitchen was still on, even though everything else, lights, refrigerator, even the living room TV, was off. My husband suggested I check the circuit breakers, but I was too frightened to go down there alone. Eventually, I did, with a flashlight and the baby in tow, but every breaker was fine. 20 minutes later, when my husband got home, the power was mysteriously back on. One day, my daughter called me to her room, saying the closet door wouldn't open. It was a heavy door with a skeleton key lock, and we'd never had issues with it before. I tried turning the knob and pulling, but it felt like someone was holding it shut from the inside. Suddenly, it slowly creaked open. My daughter took off running, and I just stood there, baffled. We also had 2 decorative plates from my aunt, one with my name and one with my husband's. They were hung side by side in the dining room. One night, we heard a crash, and when we went to check, one plate was on the floor, cracked, and a good 5 feet from the wall. We shook our heads and returned to the living room. 5 minutes later, there was another crash. The second plate had also fallen, cracked in a different place, and just as far from the wall. We decided to change the wallpaper in the kitchen and hallway, finishing up one afternoon. A few days later, we woke up to find deep scratches on the wallpaper behind the couch, extending down the hallway to the baseboard. The scratches were at least a foot higher than our cat could reach. It felt as though someone was angry about the changes we'd made. One evening, my brother and sister-in-law were over, and we told them about the strange things happening. My brother-in-law, a skeptic, just laughed. But as I was explaining the scratches, the pencil sharpener mounted on the kitchen wall suddenly flew off, hitting the dryer 6 feet away. My brother-in-law's jaw dropped, and he turned to his wife, saying, "Let's go." We lived in that apartment for 2 years, and those strange things continue to happen. We never felt threatened enough to leave. I never saw a photo of Mr. Tate, but I'm convinced he was the spirit that shared our apartment. We moved out because we had to, not because of him. 30 years have passed, but I still think about those experiences. I wonder if the people living there now are seeing the same things. What you've just read is true. I have no reason to make any of this up. After living in that apartment for 2 years, I went from a skeptic to a true believer. Growing up, my mother had a cat named Max. He was only a year old when I was born, so I grew up with him by my side. Even as a baby, Max wouldn't stray far from me. When I'd reach out toward him, he'd move just far enough away to stay out of reach. As I got older, we became inseparable. I was the only one who could pick him up without him putting up a fuss, and I loved him dearly. If I was sad, he'd let me curl up with him and cry. He was more than a pet, he was my best friend. When I was 14, Max's health took a sudden turn. His kidneys were failing, and he was in constant pain. The only humane option was to put him to sleep, as he could barely manage walking a few feet without needing to rest. My mom scheduled the appointment for that evening, hoping a quieter vet's office would ease his anxiety. Though her decision was rational, I was heartbroken. I wanted my friend to be at peace, but I couldn't bear the thought of saying goodbye. I spent the day in misery, just wanting Max to be free of pain. That evening, we took him to the vet. I held him on my lap, wrapped in a blanket, trying to comfort him. He was so frail, so thin. In the exam room, we placed him on the cold metal table, but Max didn't struggle, even though he normally hated being at the vet. We petted him, told him everything would be okay, and the vet gently put him to sleep. I kissed him on the top of his head one last time. As we left, the vet, sympathetic, waived the fee for the procedure. In the days that followed, something strange began happening. I'd be walking through the house and see Max, as clear as day, lounging on the floor or padding over to where his food dish used to be. It happened multiple times, and finally, I mentioned it to my mom. I said, "I know it sounds crazy, but I keep seeing Max." She smiled gently and said she'd been seeing him too. Sometimes, at work, she'd even feel him brush up against her leg. While part of me worried I was losing my mind, another part found comfort in the thought that Max was still watching over us. 2 weeks later, we decided to send in an adoption application to a local German Shepherd rescue. We expected it would take at least a month to find a match, giving us more time to grieve. But just 2 days after applying, we got a call from the rescue. They had an elderly dog in need of a foster home. Her name was Fila, and she was 10 years old. My mom couldn't say no to an elderly dog in need, so we agreed to foster her and had 5 days to prepare. During those days, sightings of Max continued as we prepared by getting dog beds, toys, and food for Fila. While I was still grieving, I felt a hint of excitement about welcoming a new pet. On the morning of Fila's arrival, I saw Max once more in my mom's office. He watched me, his mouth moving in.
A silent meow, and then he vanished. That was the last time I saw him. Fila arrived later that day, and to our surprise, she settled in right away, rolling in the grass and napping comfortably after only 30 minutes. The rescue team said they'd never seen a dog adjust so quickly. A few days later, I realized I hadn't seen Max since Fila arrived. I told my mom, I think he's gone. I haven't seen him since Fila got here. She nodded, and after a moment I said, maybe he was watching over us, and now that we have Fila he's moved on. My mom nodded silently, both of us sensing the truth in it. To this day, we believe Max stayed with us for those 2 weeks to comfort us, his family, until he felt we'd be all right. When Fila arrived, he must have known we were in good hands and that his job was done. It was sad to see him go, but we're grateful for the time he stayed, watching over us as our own angel until he could pass that role on to Fila. I've had paranormal encounters for as long as I can remember, but this one is one of the most unique. Since it happened just a week ago, the memory is still vivid. When my mother was younger, she had a close friend named Michael. He was tall, thin, and had served in the U.S. military, though I'm not sure in what role. One night, they were hanging out in his car. She got out to go inside, and he stayed in the car with the windows rolled up. Somehow, he ended up sitting there too long without ventilation. The carbon monoxide buildup in the car led to a tragic lack of oxygen. By the time anyone realized, it was too late. Michael had died. And it was snowing that night. Years later, in 1996, I was born, and my mother gave me Michael's name as my middle name. It was her way of keeping his memory alive, and in a way he's been part of me ever since. Now, fast forward to last week. It was a typical cloudy winter day with no snow on the ground, thanks to the strange weather we've been having here in the Berkshires. I live close to a bike path, and since my mother lost her car about a year ago, I often take my bike out to run errands and do the grocery shopping. That afternoon, I set out on the path. As I rode down the smooth trail, I noticed something ahead, maybe 100 yards away. At first, it was just a tall shape, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure, standing and rocking slightly from side to side. It looked like it was draped in something white, almost like a sheet. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe there was dust or something causing me to see things. But when I looked again, it was still there, moving gently. The closer I got, the stronger the presence felt. By the time I reached the edge of a small bridge, maybe 25 to 40 yards away, I had slowed to a stop. Dusk was just settling in, and in the quiet, I heard my name. I'm a medium, so it wasn't unusual for me to pick up on spirits. But this was different. The voice was heavy and deep, calling my name with a tone that was unmistakable. This was Michael. I could see him clearly, as if he were standing there in broad daylight, calling to me. Shock coursed through me, almost paralyzing. Part of me wanted to turn and acknowledge him, but fear held me back. I thought, I don't even know who or what is calling my name. So instead, I turned around and took a different route. As I rode away, his voice grew louder, with a weighty, deep tone that reminded me of the guy from the Allstate commercials, though Michael was white. The entire shopping trip, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. It didn't hit me until I was in the grocery store. Suddenly, it was as if someone had smacked me in the back of the head. I realized it had been Michael. I went home and told my mother about the encounter. She listened carefully and believed me, but she didn't know what to make of it either. She mentioned that Michael's favorite Gatorade flavor was the blue one. The next day, when I opened my locker at school, I don't usually lock it. The first thing I saw was a nearly empty blue Gatorade bottle sitting there, like it had been placed intentionally. This encounter with Michael left me feeling both unsettled and comforted, like he was reaching out, reminding me of his presence. It was as if he was letting me know he's still around, watching over us in his own way. About 2 years ago, I moved in with a friend, Kurt, fully aware that his house was haunted. I'd spent the night there before and had been woken up by the sound of singing and muffled conversation. At first, we thought it was his mother, but when we checked, she had already left for work. After hearing Kurt's stories and experiencing some strange occurrences myself, it was clear that, while the house had paranormal activity, nothing seemed malicious. Months passed without anything truly frightening happening, but then one night changed everything. I slept in Kurt's room on an air mattress at the foot of his bed. The events of that day were so ordinary that I barely remember them now. It's what happened that night that's unforgettable. I fell asleep lying on my left side, with my right arm tucked under my pillow, facing Kurt's bed. At some unknown hour, I woke briefly and remember seeing a pair of feet directly in front of me. Groggy, I drifted back to sleep, but soon after, I awoke again in a strange position. My arms were extended, and the top half of my body was up on Kurt's bed as if I was trying to climb onto it. Confused about how I'd gotten there, I suddenly felt a powerful force slam me back onto my air mattress. The next thing I knew, I was screaming. It felt as if something was sitting or pressing down on me. I could feel myself struggling, my arms and legs flailing, but I couldn't see anything. All I could hear was the screaming, not even realizing it was me. It wasn't until I heard Kurt shouting, "Dude," that I stopped. The sensation of weight on me lifted, but I was left shaken, feeling as though something was still watching me. That intense feeling of being watched lingered for over a week. It was unlike anything I had experienced before, and nothing like this had ever happened in Kurt's house before or since. The other paranormal events had always been subtle and nonviolent. I've tried many times to make sense of what happened that night. I can only think of two possibilities. Either some spirit tried to possess me or I was attacked outright. It's possible that whatever it was had never been in the house before and left soon after. Some have suggested it might have been a seizure or a panic attack, but no one who wasn't there can really understand. Even Kurt didn't wake up until I was already screaming. I know what I saw and felt. The sensation of being forcefully pulled and slammed down, of being unable to fight back, was as real as anything I've ever experienced, and it was terrifying. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I shared a tiny room with my older brother. We had a bunk bed. He slept on the top bunk and I slept on the bottom. The room was barely bigger than a walk-in closet, with a small closet tucked into the far left corner. I can't remember the exact month when this all began, but the events themselves remain vivid. One night, after playing video games in the living room, I crawled into bed. My brother was already fast asleep, but I was wide awake, staring into the dark. As I lay there, I started noticing something in my closet. A figure began emerging slowly, and I felt my entire body freeze with fear. The figure was tall, around 5 feet 11 inches, and draped in a black robe darker than any black I'd ever seen. Its face was hidden in shadow, with only the lower part faintly visible, a pale yellowish color. Paralyzed with fear, I stayed as still as possible, but I was sure it knew I was there. It moved out of the closet slowly, stopping at the side of my bed, standing there facing away. I carefully pulled my covers over my head, hoping I could hide from it, hoping it wasn't real. But I couldn't bring myself to fall asleep that night. The next day, I told one of my friends at school about the figure. She immediately grabbed a teacher, who brushed it off, telling me it was just my imagination. She even suggested shining a light on it if I saw it again. But I couldn't imagine being brave enough to shine a light on that figure. Over the next few weeks, it continued. Each night, I would lay in bed, feeling tense and helpless, watching this black-robed figure emerge from my closet and make its way to the side of my bed, always standing there as if waiting, almost mocking my fear. One night, my cousin came over for a sleepover, and we set up a makeshift bed near the far end of the bunk bed. That night, the figure appeared again, standing over him for about 20 minutes before returning to my bedside. I never figured out what this shadowy figure was, but the memory has stayed with me. Now, years later, I'm engaged, and my fiancée and I still live in the same room. I've told her about the figure and, strangely enough, she's had her own uneasy feelings about the closet. Once, while lying near it to work on her homework, she felt as though something was watching her. The sensation was so unsettling that she moved away from it. Just last night, I woke up in the early hours, around 3 or 4 a.m., and saw a figure near my TV. I quickly shut my eyes and went back to sleep, but it left me shaken. I'm looking for guidance on what this could be and how to understand or address it. The sense of being watched, especially around the closet, lingers to this day. On a school field trip in June 2006, we traveled from Boston, Massachusetts to New York City. It was our third night in Boston, and we'd be heading to NYC the next morning. So my friend Jojo and I decided to do some laundry to have fresh clothes for the rest of the trip. We were in the laundry room of the Courtyard Hotel where we were staying, which felt incredibly isolated. No other buildings within a couple of miles, just a dirt road and a forest out back. We started making jokes about how this was exactly the kind of place where you'd end up in a horror movie, and that we'd probably get murdered out there in the middle of nowhere. As we were loading the dryer, I got a call from our bunkmate, who said she was bored and wanted to come hang out with us. Just after I hung up, we heard a loud knock on the door. The room we were in was small, barely big enough for the washer, dryer, and a couple of people, so Jojo and I glanced out the door's window, thinking it was her. But no one was there. I assumed she might be playing a prank and went down the hall to look for her. But I didn't see a single person. When I got back to the laundry room, I closed the door, and we went back to loading the machine. Now, for those who aren't familiar, hotel door handles are on separate tracks. If you move the handle on the outside, it doesn't affect the handle on the inside and vice versa. Just as we started the dryer, the handle on the inside of our door started jiggling violently, as if someone was desperately trying to get out of the room. We both froze, staring at the handle. Then it stopped. I went over to the door and tested the handle myself to confirm that the inside handle wouldn't move if the outside one did. And sure enough, it didn't. I turned around to tell Jojo, and as I did, I saw a face staring at me through the small window on the door, locking eyes with me. I opened my mouth to scream, and Jojo turned just in time to see it too. Without a word, we both bolted from the laundry room, our hearts racing. Oh, and I should mention we were on the 3rd floor at 2 a.m. There was no way there could have been someone outside our window. I highly doubt any hotel would have maintenance workers or window cleaners working in the middle of the night, let alone on the 3rd floor. I've always been skeptical of ghosts, especially the idea of them being able to manipulate objects or make themselves visible. But since that night, I can't get that face out of my mind, and I can't explain what happened in that laundry room. That night, I became a believer. I live in a town known for ghost sightings and haunted places, and every house I've lived in seems to have had some level of paranormal activity. Right now, I live in an apartment in a quiet neighborhood. My landlord has mentioned to my dad that the upstairs is haunted. Nothing too intense, just stories about things flying off tables. I've lived here for over 2 years, and I still can't shake an uneasy feeling. When I first moved in, everything seemed normal, but within a few months, strange things started happening. One summer day, I was home alone with my dog. I went to the bathroom, and just as I was about to leave, the shower turned on by itself. I froze, staring at the water running. After a moment, I reached out, turned it off, grabbed my dog, and waited outside until my dad came home. My parents have been divorced for a while, so that night, I packed a bag and stayed at my mom's house for a few days. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not even my older brother. As the months passed, things settled down, until late May, when I learned that my best friend, a family friend I'd known since birth, had passed away. The night I found out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if someone was there with me, everywhere I went. The next day at school, I told a friend, who's experienced her share of ghostly encounters. She asked if I'd had a chance to say goodbye. I hadn't. My friend had been in New Hampshire when she died. My friend then explained, "You felt watched because she was there to say goodbye." That gave me a lot of comfort, knowing she was with me in some way. Over the summer, I spent nearly every day at my dad's house. One afternoon, I was out walking my dog and passed a parked car with a woman sitting in it. She looked to be around 50 with long blonde hair. I kept walking, but something told me to turn back. When I did, the car was empty. I knew she hadn't left. I would have heard the door open and close. Things stayed quiet for a while, but once school started again, I spent the night at my mom's house. One night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. and, standing right in front of me, was the same woman I'd seen in the car. I screamed, calling for my mom. She came upstairs, said a prayer, and placed several Bibles around the room before having me sleep downstairs that night. I still see this woman often, in my dreams and occasionally in real life, but I don't feel like she wants to harm me.
Just when I thought things were settling down again, my 15-year-old brother walked up to me yesterday and said, "Why were you in my room watching me sleep this morning?" I was completely thrown off and replied, "You're insane. What time did you see me watching you?" He answered, "Around 10 a.m. I was shocked. "I was asleep at 10 a.m., and we've been home alone all day," I told him. He shrugged it off, but I can't stop thinking about it. Lately, I've been feeling as if someone is watching me, but this presence feels different. It doesn't feel like my friend who passed away. It feels darker. I don't know if I'm just imagining things or if there's something real going on. I need help understanding if this is real or if I'm losing my mind. My name is Chelsea, and I've spent my entire life, 19 years, living in a small town, Auburn, Massachusetts. Recently, I discovered that the house I've lived in all these years is over 100 years old. Back in the early 1900s, it was one of the only houses on our street, surrounded by vast farmland. As I grew up, I learned more about the house's eerie history. There's an old bomb shelter in the basement, evidence that it burned down at one point, and I heard from neighbors that several houses on our street mysteriously caught fire back in the 1970s. My parents bought the house in 1990 and completely renovated it. My dad even filled the bomb shelter with pavement and removed an old well that was once down there. Since I was a young girl, my sister and I have experienced strange, inexplicable occurrences in this house. I remember vividly an incident that happened when I was around 13. I had a nightmare that night, and wanting some comfort, I went to my parents' room. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed a figure standing on the steps, a little girl, around 9 years old, with long brown braids and a bonnet, wearing a white shirt and shorts. She was calm and smiled at me. I hesitated, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear, and returned her smile cautiously. She didn't speak when I asked who she was. Feeling bold, I reached out, but my hand went right through her, like passing through a dense mist. That's when it hit me. She wasn't real. Heart pounding, I rushed up the stairs to my parents and told them everything, but they brushed it off as a bad dream. After that night, I started seeing her more frequently, usually just at a distance, watching silently. I could sense she was friendly, but there was something darker in the house, something that made me feel unwelcome. Every time I spoke about these encounters, it seemed like strange things would escalate. One night, I had a sleepover with my friend Nicole, and after we fell asleep, we were both startled awake by a loud bang from my sister's room. We ran in to find my sister on the floor, her left eye bleeding. She'd fallen and hit her eye on the corner of her desk, and she ended up needing surgery. Later that same day, as I was heading down the cellar stairs, I suddenly felt a strong push from behind and tumbled down. It didn't feel like I tripped, something had shoved me. Fortunately, I caught myself with my hand just before hitting the wall. That night, my dad came home visibly shaken. He had gone out to dinner with a friend, and while eating, he choked on a piece of steak. He was saved only because someone nearby knew the Heimlich maneuver. After all these incidents, I began to feel as though something sinister was warning me to stay quiet by harming my family and me. The experiences only became stranger from there. One night, I left the door open between my room and my sister's room, a habit I had when she was home because she was often scared. That night, I woke up suddenly from a bad dream around 3 a.m. My room was pitch dark, the TV was off, and I felt an eerie silence. As I glanced toward my sister's room, I saw a figure in the crack of the door, a black shape, darker than the surrounding night. It was motionless at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed it had glowing yellow eyes and sharp teeth. It was watching me intently, almost like it was sizing me up. I couldn't look away, paralyzed by fear, as it slowly began moving toward me, inching closer and closer. Trying to convince myself it wasn't real, I shut my eyes tightly for a second. When I opened them again, the figure had moved to the middle of my room, still watching me with those piercing yellow eyes. Panicking, I jumped out of bed, scrambled to turn on the light, and when the room lit up, it was gone. Since that night, I never leave the door open between our rooms. I've told my family and friends some parts of the story, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever is in this house isn't just any spirit. I'm certain it was real, and I know it was after me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.
After seeing that dark figure in my sister's room, I sat awake that night, haunted by the memory of it. I knew, somehow, that it was after me, but I couldn't begin to understand why. A few years later, my sister moved out to live on her college campus with friends. My parents turned her old room into my dad's office, so he wouldn't have to work down in the basement anymore. But even though she was gone, strange things kept happening. Every day and night, I'd hear movement in my dad's new office. Cabinets opening and closing, typing sounds on his computer, the chair creaking as if someone were sitting in it. I checked to see if my dad was there, but every time the room was empty. It felt as if the presence had settled into the space, making it its own. One night, my friend Brittany came over. She had never believed in spirits, brushing them off as figments of people's imagination. But after that night, her perspective changed completely. In the middle of the night, she said she felt someone yank her blankets off, then sit down on her bed and start yelling, "Why are you here? And why is the computer on?" Terrified, she looked over at me and saw that I was fast asleep. That morning, she was visibly shaken and told me she was starting to believe there was something in my house. Another time, my friend Jamie, who was also a non-believer, experienced something similar. And even my boyfriend, who'd never believed in spirits at all, encountered something he couldn't explain. One night as we slept, he jolted awake, feeling something lift his leg and press down hard on his thigh before dropping it back on the bed. I woke up to his panicked voice, and he looked at me, pale with fear, saying he would never spend another night in my house. It seemed that every sleepover turned into a terrifying ordeal. All my friends who'd once dismissed spirits now believed. I started feeling as though these presences were trying to communicate with me, but the messages felt unclear and heavy. The strangest experience happened on February 9th, 2011. I've never been one to sleepwalk, yet that night, I found myself waking up in the basement. It was pitch black, and I reached out my hands, feeling only the cold walls around me. In panic, I started screaming and crying. I hate the dark, and the isolation of the basement made it worse. After I calmed myself enough to feel around, my foot hit the basement stairs, and I scrambled up them, eventually reaching the living room. I couldn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I asked my mom why she hadn't come when I was screaming. She told me she hadn't heard any screams, just the sound of the basement door opening and closing. She didn't hear my cries at all, and neither did my dad. Every night feels like a new beginning of this haunting. I'm constantly asking myself, who are they? What do they want from me? Who is that little girl? What happened here? One day, in an attempt to find answers, I decided to confront them. I turned off my bedroom light, sat on the floor, and quietly called for the little girl to appear. I didn't see her, but I could hear faint whispering. I couldn't make out any of the words, but it was enough to unsettle me. Still determined, I went down to the basement to my dad's old office, hoping it might bring them closer. I sat in the dark, calling out to the spirits, asking them to reveal themselves. Suddenly, the lights started flickering, and the room filled with a heavy, uncomfortable presence. The clock on the wall began to tick loudly, each sound echoing in the stillness, but no figure appeared. Frustrated and frightened, I got up to leave. As I passed my dad's workbench, the table holding his tools began to shake violently, as though someone was rattling it. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding. When I got back upstairs, things were even stranger. All the fans in the house had turned on to full speed. The clocks ticked loudly, and my dog, whose collar had somehow been removed, sat trembling, her eyes wide with fear. Desperate, I shouted, "What do you want from me?" In response, I heard a deep, guttural growl, followed by sinister laughter. Overwhelmed, I ran outside and started crying. The energy was so dark, so oppressive, that I felt like it had wrapped itself around me. When I finally calmed myself and went back inside, I tried to distract myself with a glass of water. As I filled the glass, I heard a voice, sounding eerily like my mother's, whispering, "Are you my American angel?" I found my American angel. I froze, knowing my mom wasn't home. She was at work. Shaken, I decided to ignore it and went to the bathroom. As I closed the door, Another voice asked, "What time is it?" Thinking it was my dad, I responded without thinking, but when I came out, the house was silent. No one was there. I just want answers. Why is this happening to me? How do I help these spirits find peace? I feel trapped, haunted by something I don't understand. I'm afraid to sleep, to spend time in the living room, to cook in the kitchen, and even to shower because I feel watched everywhere. When I shower, I try to sing to drown out the fear, but it no longer helps. I don't want to live in fear anymore. I just want peace in my own home. Recently, I met someone named Mike. There's something mysterious about him, as though he knows everything about me without needing to ask. Like me, he's a medium, someone who can sense and communicate with spirits. Today, we tried something together that I never imagined I'd do with anyone. We were sitting on his bed, just gazing into each other's eyes, when he suddenly asked, "Chelsea, who are you really?" Without realizing what was happening, I felt myself slipping away. I heard myself answer, almost involuntarily, "Emily Harris." Mike leaned in closer and asked, "Why are you in Chelsea's body?" With a voice that wasn't quite my own, I responded, "Because Chelsea needs to know." He kept his gaze steady and asked, "What does Chelsea need to know?" And without hesitation, I replied, "That she needs to help me." With patience and a calm tone, he asked, "Help you with what, Emily?" I felt a surge of sorrow as the answer came out of my mouth. I saw my 2 children die before my eyes in a fire that I could not stop. In that moment, Mike seemed to sense something around us. "Your 2 children are right behind you, Emily," he said softly. "Is Marcus your son?" I felt a tear slide down my cheek as I answered, "Yes, he is." He then asked, "What is your daughter's name?" But for some reason, no answer came. Emily remained silent, holding back the name. Mike tried a different approach. "How old are you, Emily?" I found myself answering, "I'm 40. Her grief filled the room, and I felt my heart ache as she continued, "I can't find my husband." Mike, with a sense of gentle urgency, asked, "Who is your husband, Emily?" Her voice, soft but sure, responded, "His name is Mark. Marcus is named after his dad." Then Mike asked, "Why can't you find him, Emily?" She answered with a bitterness that felt ancient, "I believe he's trapped. The owners of the house paved in the bomb shelter and took out the well." He pressed, "Does that make you mad, Emily?" In a tone filled with raw, unfiltered emotion, she responded, "Yes." As her presence grew stronger in me, her emotions began to overwhelm Mike. I could see the fear in his eyes as he struggled to keep control. Finally, he asked, "Emily, can you give me Chelsea back, please?" In a heartbeat, I felt myself return. Disoriented, I jumped off the bed, looking at Mike, scared and confused. As he explained everything that had just happened, it became clear that Emily had been trying to possess me. She'd managed it once before in my sleep, leading me to the basement, the place she believed her husband was trapped. Suddenly, so much of the unexplained made sense. The heavy, painful feeling I always felt in the house wasn't just in my head. It was Emily's sorrow, her unresolved grief. The little girl I'd seen roaming the house was her daughter, and the laughter and sounds of small footsteps at night were her children playing. They were all there, waiting for something, needing me to understand. After helping Emily leave, I felt an intense energy coming from Mike. As I looked into his eyes, they seemed darker, almost as if a shadow had crossed over them. Something or someone was within him too. I placed my hands on his face, looked directly into his eyes, and asked, "Why are you mad?" With a voice not entirely his own, he responded, "How do you know it's me?" I repeated, "Why are you mad?" He replied in a low tone, "I was murdered." Feeling a chill run down my spine, I asked, "Who murdered you?" He spoke the name of his killer, his voice filled with anger and pain. "What's your name?" I asked. His response was just one word, "Bullet." Refusing to accept that answer, I pressed on, "No, what is your real name?" For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, with reluctance, he answered, "Brandon." I could feel the depth of his anger as I asked, "Why are you possessing Mike, Brandon?" His answer was simple yet filled with rage. "I want the person who murdered me hurt really badly." I sighed, feeling a deep sadness for the spirit, and asked, "Do you want me to tell Mike this?" "Yes," he replied, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and determination. I tried to reason with him. "What do you think Mike could do, Brandon? There's nothing we can do to change what happened." But he wouldn't let go, saying, "Hurt him." My heart ached for this spirit, but I couldn't give him what he wanted. "I can't hurt him, Brandon," I said firmly. Frustrated, he threatened, "Then I will never leave Mike alone." Taking a deep breath, I responded, "Brandon, please give Mike back so I can help. I'll do everything I can to find justice for you, but I need Mike back." After a tense moment, Brandon released his grip, and I saw Mike's eyes return to normal. Shaken, he looked at me and asked what had happened. I told him everything, from Brandon's story to his haunting demand for revenge. Mike looked solemn as he listened, and when I finished, he explained that Brandon had been like a brother to him in life. Being a medium, Mike was open to spirits, and Brandon had clung to him, unable to move on. Both Mike and I feel trapped, like we're carrying the weight of these spirits. We're both in need of help. Someone who understands and can help us release them, maybe even free them. We're desperate for answers and guidance, hoping to finally find peace for ourselves and the souls who cling to us. I was a senior in high school, just about to graduate. It was April 2010, and I'd never experienced anything paranormal in my life. In my mind, ghosts only existed in movies. Little did I know what was coming. It all began in my room. We had a large house, and my room was spacious too. The house wasn't old. We moved in back in 1998, and it was built in 1995, only about 14 years old at the time. One evening, I was watching TV, sitting on the couch in my room, when suddenly, a paper cup rolled off the coffee table and kept rolling until it hit my desk chair, which was quite far from where I was. My first thought was that the ceiling fan might have caused it. That same night, I woke up to a loud thud in my room. I ignored it and went back to sleep, but then another thud jolted me awake again. When I turned on the light, I saw two glasses that I'd left on my desk lying on the floor, like they'd been knocked off forcefully. As time passed, I graduated and summer arrived. One night, after a late hangout with friends, I came home around 2 a.m. As soon as my friend drove away, I felt a sudden wave of fear and anxiety. Walking up the driveway, it felt as if someone was right behind me, urging me to hurry. My heart started racing, and I was practically running by the time I got inside. Once in, I was breathing heavily and felt an intense dread. To get to my room, I'd go through the study and up a flight of stairs. Opening the study door made those feelings even stronger. I was scared to go up the stairs. When I reached my room, I turned on all the lights and just sat on my bed, out of breath, trying to calm down. Eventually, I decided to leave the lights on and try to sleep. Here's a quick layout of my room. You come up the stairs, and there's a window to your right. My bed is straight ahead, with the TV, couch, desk, and an old piano on the left side. Just as I was about to drift off, the window suddenly flew open, loudly, scaring me half to death. That's when I began to realize that something strange was going on. Throughout the summer, the activity intensified. I'd hear knocks on the ceiling, strange creaks and crackles, sounds I'd never heard in my room before. There was this constant, negative vibe in there, like something evil was lurking around. I didn't understand why it was all happening so suddenly. Summer ended, and I started my first year at a nearby community college. I'd get home around 11 a.m. and have the house to myself until 3 p.m. Most days, nothing unusual happened, but some days were different. Let's just skip to the worst experience I had. One afternoon, I came home, made some lunch, and went down to the basement to watch TV and eat. I left the basement door open as usual. About 30 to 45 minutes later, I heard the door slam shut, hard, like someone had angrily slammed it after an argument. I thought, all right, let's see what's going on. I went back upstairs to put my plate away, but this time, I closed the basement door behind me. After putting my plate in the sink, I noticed that the basement door had opened again, even though I knew I'd closed it. I checked to see if anyone was home, but no one was. Then I went to my room and found that my window was wide open, the farthest it could go. By this time, it was October. I shut the window tightly and went downstairs for a bit. When I came back up to check Facebook, the window was open again. I started freaking out. I locked it tight, went to the bathroom to change, and while looking in the mirror, which reflects the hallway, I saw my bedroom door slam shut with such force that the walls shook. Felt like the Hulk had slammed it. I was terrified, jumped into my car, and drove to a friend's house, spending the entire day there because I felt genuinely unsafe at home. One date I'll never forget is October 15th, 2010. I remember thinking, wow, nothing strange has happened in a while. And just like that, everything stopped. My room, which had once made me feel terrified, became peaceful again, just as it had been before April. Whatever was haunting me vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I still remember that old piano in my room. I never liked looking at it. I always felt a sense of dread when I did. Also, it seemed like whatever was in my room didn't appreciate it when I went out with my friends. It felt as if it got restless or angry whenever I left. Now, it's October 10th, 2012, 2 years later, and I'm away at college. I've never experienced anything like that again. I still wonder why I was haunted for those 6 months and why it all started and ended so abruptly. I never told my parents or siblings. Only 2 close friends who thought I was crazy. I've been seeing ghosts for as long as I can remember. I'll start with my very first experience and some of the strange things my family experienced in that same building. We lived in a big red apartment on High St back then. My brother and I shared a room, but for some reason he would often sneak out to the living room to sleep, and my mom would end up sleeping there too, especially when my dad was away for work. He drove trucks, so he was often gone for days at a time. One night, I woke up to find my brother missing from our room. When I looked out of the window, I saw a man standing outside, staring right in. He didn't say a word. He was just standing there, looking through the glass. The strange thing was, our building was on a hill, and our backyard had a 6-foot drop directly below my window. The window was about a foot higher than the drop, so logically, it was impossible for anyone to be standing there at that height. Terrified, I ran to the living room where my mom was lying on the couch watching TV and told her, "Mom, there's a man at my window." She followed me back to my room, sat me down on the bed, and tried to calm me, saying, "See, there's no one there." I looked back at her and said, "But he's right behind you." The shock on her face said it all. She grabbed me, and we spent the rest of the night sleeping together in the living room, too scared to go back to my room. Later, my mom told me about other strange things that happened in that apartment. One unsettling thing was the fire alarm. It would go off on its own, even though it was one of those alarms that was wired to alert the fire department. She'd call them and ask if they received a signal, but they always said that they hadn't heard anything. It was as if only we could hear it. Another strange incident happened while my brother and I were watching Barney in the living room one day. Suddenly, the front door unlocked itself and opened. My brother and I were only 3 and 4 years old at the time, so we were both too young to have unlocked it, but I was tall enough to reach the lock, so...
My mom assumed it was me. She'd get frustrated, thinking I was playing around, but I kept insisting I hadn't done it. This happened more than once, and each time, I'd tell her it wasn't me, even though no one else was around to open the door. Another odd experience involved my uncle. He was nailing a board over a hole in the barn attached to the apartment so that my brother and I wouldn't get into it. After he'd hammered in the nails, he went outside for a smoke, and when he returned, he found that all the nails had been carefully pulled out. The board was sitting neatly beside the hole, as if someone had gently removed it. It was unsettling, and he couldn't explain it. These things kept happening, and my mom started to feel uneasy. She did some research on the apartment's history and discovered that the previous landlord had hung himself in that very barn. It made everything feel even creepier, as if his spirit might still be lingering around. Over time, I had so many similar experiences that it became almost normal for me. My memory is a bit blurry since this happened when I was so young, and I've had countless experiences since then. From ages 12 to 17, I remember seeing spirits so often that I started ignoring them. Whenever I'd see something, I'd try to turn away instead of interacting. There was one spirit that kept appearing, but I'll share more about that one later. In the mid-1970s, my uncle and his family bought an old house just outside Boston in a town called Newtonville. I don't know the exact date it was built, but I do remember seeing late 1700s painted in black on the chimney, as was the tradition in that historic neighborhood. The house was large, with two staircases, one narrow, steep staircase in the front and another in the back. When we would visit, I always felt uncomfortable in the house, but as a child, I couldn't explain exactly why. There was just something about it that unsettled me. At the time, my aunt and uncle were involved with the Boston Ballet, and both of my cousins were ballerinas. To 8-year-old me, that was the coolest thing ever. So, when they invited me to attend a performance of Sleeping Beauty and then spend the night with my cousin, I was thrilled. Although I wasn't too excited about staying at their old house, the chance to see a ballet and hang out with my older cousin was too good to pass up. That night, dressed in my best outfit, I went to the Wong Theater with my aunt, uncle, and cousin. I even got to go backstage and see the dancers getting ready. I was in total awe. After the performance and dinner, we returned to the house. My cousin and I changed into our nightgowns and got ready for bed. At one point, I remembered I had to ask my uncle something, so I went downstairs using the back staircase. The downstairs was dark and very cold, with only a small amount of light from the hallway above. Realizing I was alone in the dim living room, I decided to head back upstairs. Off to the side of the living room was an alcove where a grand piano sat quietly. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound, a deep, moaning noise that sounded like it came from a man. I froze, certain my uncle was hiding behind the piano trying to scare me. He knew I found the house creepy after all. I whispered, "Uncle Roy," but the moaning continued. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I leaned down to catch him in the act. But when I looked, no one was there. Just then, I heard my uncle's voice upstairs in his bedroom, talking to my aunt. I felt paralyzed with fear. If my uncle was upstairs, then who or what was making the sound? Summoning all the courage I had, I ran back up the stairs, barely feeling my feet hit the steps. I found my uncle and told him everything that had just happened. He didn't believe me, though, and I never brought it up again, fearing I'd be teased. Years went by, and my uncle and his family eventually moved out of the house. One day, I asked him if he remembered that night I'd stayed over after the ballet. He said he did, and looking back, he believed the house had indeed been haunted. Then he shared something with me that I hadn't known. Apparently, strange things would often happen in that house. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. There were strange noises at night, and my cousin's attic door would be closed at bedtime, but mysteriously open in the morning. Then my aunt and uncle made a mistake. They decided to use a Ouija board to try to contact the spirit in the house. At first, they asked simple questions like, "Who are you?" and "Did you used to live here?" The planchette kept moving toward goodbye, but my uncle continued asking questions, trying to get more answers. Whatever spirit was there didn't like this. The room turned icy cold, and the air felt thick and heavy. Suddenly, their German shepherd, who was outside at the time, began howling. Concerned about waking the neighbors, they brought him inside. Terrified, my aunt and uncle sat in bed, reading the Bible until the strange, oppressive feeling finally left in the early hours of the morning. After that night, they never used a Ouija board again, and my uncle strongly advised me to stay away from it as well. Now, whenever I see my uncle at family gatherings, this story always comes up. He still reminds me, stay away from the Ouija board.
Brian was the son of my godmother, and though we weren't related by blood, we saw each other as cousins. He was 3 years younger than me and one of the kindest people I've ever known. I was 21 in the late 1980s, visiting my younger sister at Salem State College just a week before Thanksgiving when I got the news. That weekend, my mom called to tell us that Brian had been in a terrible car accident in Virginia and had passed away. He was only 18. I was devastated and inconsolable. Brian was the first person close to my age who had died, and his sudden loss was almost too much to handle. In the short Thanksgiving week that followed, I would spend my lunch breaks at a nearby church, just to think and pray. One day, I asked Brian if he could ask God for a little snow that Christmas, as the season had been dry so far. Then I went back to trying to adjust to life without him, though the sadness lingered. A few weeks before Christmas, I was driving home from a babysitting job when thoughts of Brian suddenly came rushing back, and I cried the whole way home. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a while, letting the tears come. Suddenly, something caught my eye on the windshield. Flakes of snow were falling, melting into tiny beads on the glass. I stopped crying and watched the snowflakes disappear into water droplets, remembering my request at the church. But when I got out of the car, I looked up, expecting to see the sky filled with snow. Instead, it was completely clear. A beautiful, cloudless night with countless stars shining. Just then, my mom drove up and asked what I was doing. I told her, but she only nodded. We went into the house, and she asked if I was okay. I started crying again. Then, from upstairs, we heard my dad calling for us to come quickly. I ran to my parents' bedroom to find my dad kneeling in front of the big picture window, staring out. "Come here, you have to see this," he said. Kneeling beside him, I looked out, unsure of what to expect. He told me to keep watching the sky, and a few seconds later, I saw it. A glowing green meteor streaking down and burning out as it neared the Earth, followed by several more shooting stars. I don't know if this was related to the snow, but the entire moment felt as if something greater was trying to comfort me, to remind me that I wasn't alone in my grief. The following summer, my family planned our usual vacation to the coast of Maine. Brian had come with us on many of these trips, and he loved everything about it: the waves, his surfboard, the beach. He was the picture of a carefree surfer boy, with sun-bleached hair, tanned skin, and his Ocean Pacific clothes. I dreaded that vacation, knowing the hole his absence would leave. Around that time, I happened upon a small shop where you could get your tarot cards read. I felt drawn to go inside. The reader began telling me things about my life and future, then suddenly paused. She looked at me and asked if I had recently lost a brother or cousin in a car accident. Shocked, I asked how she knew, and she replied that he kept showing up in the cards. I couldn't hold back my tears. She reassured me that he didn't want me to be sad and wanted me to stop crying because he was okay. I left feeling both shaken and comforted. A few weeks later, I dreamt of Brian. He asked me why I was crying, and I told him it was because I'd never see him again. He looked at me as if to say, "You know better than that." Then he disappeared. On the morning of my wedding in April 2006, I felt his presence again. I took it as a sign that he was happy for me and approved of the person I was marrying. My godmother, Brian's mother, came to my wedding, and when I told her, she said she felt him there as well. A few weeks ago, while going through photos in the garage for a different story, I came across a picture from one of our beach vacations in Maine. In it, my sisters, Brian, and I are smiling in a human pyramid, with Brian at the very top, his sun-bleached hair tousled by the breeze, and one hand raised toward the sky. It's how I'll always remember him. Forever happy, forever at peace. Rest in peace, my friend. Boston, Massachusetts, March 11, 1960. I was only 3 months old when I nearly died. A sudden seizure stopped my breathing, and if I hadn't been in the hospital, I might not be here today. At almost the exact same time, my birth father, Freddie, was in Long Beach, California, where he tragically died in a motorcycle accident. Although we both died within an hour, I survived. My birth parents never raised me. I was adopted at birth by a loving family who became my true family. And while this was the end for Freddie, it was also the beginning of something strange and unexplainable for both of us. Growing up, I had my first paranormal experiences at my grandparents' beach house. From as early as 5 years old, I dreaded going up the staircase there. Despite being bright and polished, it filled me with an urge to run as if I was being chased. It wasn't until years later that I realized I wasn't alone in sensing something unusual in the house. A friend who stayed with me once asked if I ever felt I could move things with my mind in that place. which startled me since I had felt the same thing but had been too afraid to try. In the late 1980s, I returned to the beach house with my daughter, where we were staying on a more permanent basis. One night, after a shower, I was hit by the unmistakable scent of my grandfather's Aqua Velva aftershave filling the room. It wasn't just the smell. It felt like he was there with me, as clear as day. My daughter, too, felt it, exclaiming, "Grandpapa!" as her plate of sandwiches flew into the air. We both ran out of the room, and I never slept there again, choosing a different bedroom. A year later, another strange incident occurred. My ex-boyfriend, who was lying on the floor watching TV with me, suddenly looked panicked as he was held down by an unseen force. I could see an impression on his shirt and a dark, wispy shape above him. He fought against it and finally broke free. We watched the shadow drift away and disappear through the front door. At the time, it felt so surreal that neither of us spoke about it until weeks later when we finally acknowledged what had happened. Not long after, I had one of my only experiences seeing a full apparition. I was helping a friend cope with her boyfriend's recent death in a car accident. As she tearfully called out to him, we both felt a chill, and I saw 6 plates fly off the shelf behind us. The air instantly felt lighter, as if her words had given him peace. In 1994, I decided to learn more about my birth father, Freddie. I had little information but was determined. One summer night, I had a dream that felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I saw Freddie standing in the middle of my room, dressed in jeans and a black leather jacket. His red hair slicked back and his blue eyes full of warmth. I felt myself getting younger and smaller as I walked toward him, until I was just a small child, reaching up to be held. He lifted me in his arms, and we locked eyes, sharing a deep, loving gaze. As he gently put me down and I returned to my adult self, I woke up crying, knowing this wasn't just a dream. The next day, I found his grave without help, as if he was guiding me. A few years later, in April 1996, I experienced my mother's death in a way I could never forget. I awoke suddenly, feeling her presence rush into me, filling me with all her thoughts, feelings, and love. I felt her as if she had become a part of me before she vanished, leaving me with an intense calm and the knowledge that she had said goodbye. Throughout my life, I also received 3 mysterious phone calls from people who had just died. The first was an old friend who'd passed away from a drug overdose, yet his number appeared on my caller ID hours after his death. Similar calls happened again with 2 more people who had passed, including my brother. Each call felt like a final goodbye. In 2005, my husband and I moved into a cottage near a lake in Salem. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but my daughter, who visited, felt an overwhelming urge to wash off the creepy every time she entered. After we moved in, strange odors like tobacco and soap would come and go, and I occasionally heard the sounds of horses or tools in the nearby shed, where my husband stored thousands of records from my late brother. Sometimes, music would play softly in the shed even when it was empty. One night, after watching scary shows with my daughter, she asked to sleep in my bed because she felt something staring at her. This was enough to motivate me to try recording for paranormal sounds. I left a recorder in the dressing room overnight, curious but not expecting much. The next day, I listened and was shocked to hear a man saying, "Let me out," and a child laughing, as if they were right next to the microphone. Over time, I collected hundreds of these recordings, and I learned to recognize voices I believed belonged to spirits from the house's history. As I continued recording, I started sensing specific presences like Henry and his wife Evelyn, who seemed to look after the house. Their voices were calm, and Henry would often talk whenever my husband was around, even answering simple questions or sharing a polite cough. But not all spirits were comforting. A child spirit named Sam lingered in my dressing room. She didn't seem as innocent as she appeared, and her presence filled me with fear. I once became obsessed with playing a creepy lullaby on my computer, over and over, until I managed to stop. I felt Evelyn had somehow intervened to calm me, while Sam's spirit seemed darker. I experienced many other things in the house, like a jellyfish-shaped figure peeking around a corner and strange, swirling lights that I believed to be Henry. My husband, who was initially skeptical, even felt the presence of a ghostly dog climbing into bed with him night after night. His dreams were haunted by a dog named Ruffles, and the experience left him shaken. During the time we lived there, I continued recording EVP, electronic voice phenomena, and eventually invited a paranormal team to investigate. They captured their own evidence, confirming that we weren't alone in the cottage. By the time we moved out due to health issues, I had over 500 recordings and countless pictures of strange lights and orbs around the house, especially near our shed. One of the most memorable EVPs was of my birth father, Freddie. One night, feeling an intense sadness, I whispered, "Are you here, Freddie?" and heard a soft response, "Yes, I am." This simple answer filled me with warmth and peace, knowing he had been with me in spirit all along. Leaving that cottage in Salem brought some relief, but the memories and experiences have stayed with me. These encounters with the paranormal have left me with both questions and comfort, knowing that those we've lost may still be closer than we realize.
I once tried to contact Alex through a Ouija board, but I'm not sure if I actually reached him. Still, I feel that when my life here ends, we'll somehow be together. Even if I fall in love with other people, I know it won't be the same as the unique connection I have with Alex. It's strange, but I hope that one day I'll see him face to face and maybe find a way to stay with him forever. Last year, my wife and I took a road trip from Florida to Ashfield, Massachusetts, to visit her family and relax. We brought along our two puppies, Sapper and Kiki, and decided to camp in state parks and forests along the way. It was a long drive, and my wife opted to take her Honda Civic instead of my Dodge Ram 1500. Although it was a tight squeeze with all our gear, food, a rifle, and the dogs packed in, it made sense to use the smaller car and save on gas. We camped on her grandfather's expansive property, which stretched out across hills and apple orchards. The town of Ashfield itself is small, a single street lined with mom-and-pop shops and a little pizza place where we ate most days, though some mornings canned food and beer did the trick. Down the road from her grandfather's place was a small, old cemetery. Curious, we made a point to visit. Wandering through, we admired the intricate designs on the old headstones, many weathered and partially buried. One in particular caught our attention. It was so worn that we couldn't make out the name or dates. As I started clearing dirt and grass from the stone, a strange knocking sound came from the bare tree overhead. Startled, I looked up, expecting a bird or branch, but the tree was almost bare, and there was hardly any wind. My wife softly said, "It's okay. We're just visiting, not here to disturb you." As soon as she spoke, there was a second knock from the tree. The sound seemed to come from the center of the trunk itself, which gave me an odd feeling, almost like butterflies in my stomach. It was a bit eerie, but not exactly frightening. The dogs, however, showed no sign of noticing and seemed entirely at ease, so we decided it must have been some sort of positive energy and moved on. As we finished exploring the cemetery and headed back toward the car, we decided to pass by the tree again. My wife said a quick goodbye out loud, but this time, the tree stayed silent. We paused, half expecting something to happen. Just as we started to walk away, there it was. 2 knocks, clear as before. We stopped in our tracks, looked around, but there was nothing else. The dogs didn't react, so we got back in the car and headed out, leaving the mystery behind. The rest of our trip was more typical, though we did have one unexpected encounter with a bear a few nights later. Being from Florida, my experience with bears is pretty limited. I'd heard that making noise scares them off, but when the moment came, all I could think to do was offer it a beer. Fortunately, my bizarre invitation worked. The bear wandered off toward a nearby blueberry bush instead of coming closer. I joked later that maybe he preferred a different brand because he passed on the Samuel Adams. In the end, it was a trip full of strange and memorable moments. Though the encounter with the knocking tree remains a mystery, I like to think we simply crossed paths with an old spirit welcoming us to Ashfield. I've been living with my mom and her friend Timmy in the same house for 4 years now. I'm only 13, and while I do have a pretty active imagination, I truly believe in the things I've experienced here. Since we moved in, I've noticed strange occurrences, especially in my bedroom and the living room, which my mom recently turned into her bedroom. Often, I'll be sitting in a room, and suddenly, it'll feel as if something cold enters the space. My room is always noticeably colder than the rest of the house. I've always had the sense I can tell when someone comes into or leaves a room without looking or hearing anything. From the start, it's felt like someone is watching or following me around the house. Just earlier today, while I was on Facebook, I felt like someone was resting their chin on my shoulder, staring at me. Whenever I tried to sneak a look without moving too much, the feeling would disappear. I even felt something icy brush against the back of my neck, which has been tingling ever since. I've heard that each ghost has a unique presence, and I'm certain the one who leaned on me is the same one that's been following me. I've also sensed different presences both inside and outside the house. Recently, my mom and I were talking about the history of our home. It's an old Victorian-era house, but most of its history is lost. We do know that the original owner had 2 daughters. One was said to be kind, named Alice, and the other, Samantha, was neglected and considered mean. Inside our front door, there's a green piece of wood with a Jewish carving on it, believed to protect the house from malevolent spirits. It was already there when we moved in, and we've never felt the need to take it down.
Sometimes I think the kind daughter, Alice, is the one who follows me around, especially since the carving is supposed to keep harmful spirits outside. But there's an outside door that leads down to our cellar, and it has a glass window. I pass by it every day on my way to school. On the first day of school this year, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A girl with flaming red hair in a Victorian-style dress, glaring at me with an expression full of anger. The memory is so vivid that I can still recall every detail of her appearance. I sometimes wonder if she's Samantha, the other daughter, who can't enter the house because of the carving. I saw her once before last winter. She was standing behind the glass, looking sad. But as soon as she noticed me, she gave me that same fierce glare. Oddly enough, I wasn't frightened. I just stared back. Eventually, it looked like she wanted to lunge at me from behind the glass. For some reason, it seems like she can't move from there. It turns out I'm not the only one who has felt a spirit's presence in the house. Timmy and I talked about it today, and he admitted that he sometimes feels like he's being watched when he's alone. I have this theory it might be far-fetched, that spirits are more drawn to children or those with a youthful spirit. I'm still somewhat immature, and Timmy is incredibly immature himself. Maybe that's why the spirits only seem to show themselves to us and not my mom. It's just a thought, but it kind of makes sense to me. I've always been a born cynic, firmly believing that every so-called ghostly experience has a logical explanation. But since my father's unexpected passing, I've had a series of experiences that I'm struggling to explain rationally. Started just a day or so after his death. My sisters and I were picking out a suit for him at the funeral home. My father had a big personality and hated wearing just plain black or white, so we chose an outfit that felt more like him. After we laid it out, my sister said, "I think he'd like it." And suddenly, the lights in the room started flickering. Then, at the funeral, the lights at the front of the church flickered a few times during the eulogy. Trying to stay rational, I told myself that maybe the bulbs needed replacing. Next came a series of dreams with my father in them. In one, we were in a room I didn't recognize, and he was there with me. At some point, I said, "Well, prove to me that you're a ghost." With a grin, he floated up to the ceiling and said, "How's that for a party trick?" Exactly his sense of humor. In another dream, shortly after I was in a car accident, he appeared and said, "Well, at least you didn't hit a parked car this time." Again, classic dad. Still, I chalked these up to just my mind processing his absence and missing his quirky sense of humor. But the strangest experience of all happened recently. My brother and brother-in-law were playing around with Vlingo, an app on their Blackberries that converts spoken words to text. My brother-in-law has a strong Boston accent, so he joked that it never translates well for him. To demonstrate, he said, "I packed the CH in Havad Yad." And sure enough, the app returned some random garbled text that had everyone laughing. Then, my sister decided to give it a try since her Boston accent isn't as strong. she said clearly. I parked the car in Harvard Yard and handed the phone back to her husband. When he read what had come out, he went pale and hesitated to show her. She insisted, so he finally handed it over. The message read, "I took the time. Love, Dad." I should explain that on the back of my father's mass card, we'd chosen a poem called The Clock of Life. The poem's message is about making the most of your time, as tomorrow isn't guaranteed. It urges readers to take time for what truly matters, to live fully. My sisters and I couldn't stop thinking about the message on the app. Sure, Vilingo isn't perfect and can sometimes make mistakes, but we couldn't understand how it could produce that specific phrase. It doesn't rhyme or sound anything like, "I parked the car in Harvard Yard." It doesn't even have the same syllable pattern. This is the one event I can't rationalize away. Now, I find myself wondering if I'm reaching, hoping to believe my father is somehow contacting us. But honestly, it's comforting to think he's still out there, being his usual self and raising a little hell. Maybe I should just accept it as a beautiful mystery. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I've always felt drawn to ghosts, spirits, angels, demons, whatever you'd like to call them. Growing up, I've had countless encounters. My mother, once a skeptic, now fully believes in the paranormal. As a child, I saw and sensed many things. Some were light and friendly, others dark and unsettling. Thankfully, I've never encountered a demon and hope I never will. It feels like spirits are attracted to me. Wherever I go, I get a strong sense of whether there's a presence. With a little focus, I can even gather some information about it. My mother calls me a medium, but I try to ignore this gift. I've learned that if I acknowledge these entities by asking questions or engaging them, it can intensify their presence. So, I try to avoid any contact as much as possible because, honestly, it scares me and I wish it would stop. Reading others' experiences online has been reassuring. It makes me feel less alone and, maybe, a little less crazy. Now, on to what's been happening recently. I have 2 young children, ages 2 and 3. Just before giving birth to my second son, my husband and I moved into an apartment complex in Belchertown, Massachusetts. We saw the apartment for the first time 2 days before I went into labor and were still moving in when I came back from the hospital with our new baby. Almost immediately, I sensed a man in the apartment. He seemed unhappy that we had moved into his space, especially with a crying newborn disturbing the nights. Spirits seem to recognize that I know they're there, and this one took pleasure in messing with me. He'd make noises whenever the baby cried, move things around, and most of all, he seemed to enjoy startling me. I could feel him trailing closely behind me as I walked down the hall, his presence raising the hairs on the back of my neck. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of him in the corner of my eye, even in broad daylight. Finally, I'd had enough. I told him firmly to leave, that I wouldn't communicate with him or help him with anything, and that he was not welcome here. For a while, he seemed to leave us alone. But a few months later, strange things started happening again. Only this time, they weren't directed at me. I don't know if it's the same spirit or not, but now it's my kids, particularly my oldest son, who are affected. One day, my eldest, then 2, began talking to me about something he called Ra. He was insistent about what he saw, and his story has never changed in over a year. He told me that Ra comes through the wall right next to his bed. Since then, I've moved his bed to the other side of the room. He started drawing circles all over the walls, saying Ra didn't like the circles and that they would keep him away. My son also said that Ra often stays on the ceiling watching him. The most frightening incident happened about a year ago. One night, I woke up to my son screaming. Assuming he'd had a bad dream, I comforted him and got him back to sleep. But the next morning, as I was changing his clothes, I noticed a large scratch across his back. It looked like a single, thick fingernail scratch, blotchy and raw. When I asked him how he got it, he insisted, Ra did it. I tried to reason with him, asking if he'd maybe fallen or if his little brother had done it. But he was adamant. No, Mommy. Ra did it. To this day, he sometimes mentions how Ra hurt him on his back, and he still says Ra comes at night. Now, my younger son has started talking about Ra too. For 6 nights straight, he woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m., a time known for paranormal activity, which sent a chill down my spine. Knowing that this thing has affected my children is terrifying. I'm now trying to teach them to be brave and to tell Ra to go away. Recently, I discovered that a man passed away in the apartment next door, in a room with a wall facing my son's bedroom. He died from cancer and his wife moved to another building afterward. I don't know if this man's spirit is what my kids are experiencing, or if there's something else haunting our space. But whatever it is, I want it to leave my family alone. I'm determined to figure out what's going on and find a way to protect my kids from this presence. In the very late 1990s, I found myself renting the basement of my parents' fifth American home. They move a lot. While sorting out my plans after finishing my bachelor's degree, I had been accepted to grad school for a master's in literature, and I was searching for a place to live in Worcester, Massachusetts. One morning in late June, I woke up with a strange certainty that I'd find the right apartment that day. About 30 minutes later, the university called and asked if I'd like to see a newly available apartment, just 2 blocks from the English department and 3 blocks from the campus center. I told them I'd come by before lunch. It was less than an hour's drive from my parents' house. The apartment, labeled 1A, was on the ground floor, facing the street. It was fairly spacious, with ceilings that had to be at least 9 or 10 feet high and a minimum of 2 windows in each room. That summer morning, it felt bright and welcoming, and best of all, it was affordable on a TA's stipend. Perfect for a grad student on a budget. The building itself was a converted 3-story triple-decker, with a single staircase originally designed to serve all 3 floors. Later, someone had built an extension that doubled the building's size, adding a second front door and an independent staircase. Additional renovations had subdivided each floor into 3 apartments instead of 2. My apartment, 1A, was the only ground-level unit that opened onto the first staircase, while apartments 1B and 1C opened onto the newer second staircase. Both sections of the building had their own front doors, which opened onto a pathway at right angles to the street. One unusual feature was an enclosed narrow porch near the front path. This porch could only be accessed from the back door of my apartment, which was located in my bedroom. I used the porch to store my garbage and recycling, as it was close to the street. There was a door from the porch that opened to the outside with sliding bolts at the top and bottom, but these could only be operated from within the porch. To get to the sidewalk, I had to exit through my living room door, go out the main entrance, walk along the path past my own back door, and then reach the sidewalk. The apartment had its quirks, with odd room arrangements that seemed like a result of constant remodeling. For instance, there was a door off the kitchen that looked like it should lead to a pantry, but it was actually a narrow, windowless bathroom about 4 feet wide and 12 feet long. It resembled a converted hallway, and due to the subdividing, it was located directly beneath the door to 2B, the middle apartment on the 2nd floor. The bathroom had its own strange layout. The sink and wall-mounted mirror were right next to the door on the left wall, followed by the chimney for 1B's fireplace, then the toilet, a small open space, where I kept a laundry-drying rack, and finally a 4-foot square shower at the end. The light fixture and exhaust fan were positioned above the drying rack near the shower. Given my early childhood trauma involving bathrooms, a story I covered in my parents' first house, I was already wary. I tried to convince myself that the uncomfortable, almost trapped feeling I got in this bathroom was just a reaction to its strange layout and lack of windows, but something about it unsettled me deeply. Once I moved in, I realized that leaving the blinds open in the living room meant anyone over 3 feet tall could easily see inside. For privacy, I closed the louvered blinds and left them shut for weeks at a time. However, this isolation seemed to affect my mood. I started feeling a creeping sense of gloom that worsened whenever I returned home. Though the rooms still looked spacious and bright, I began to feel as if the apartment itself was trying to appear light and airy in spite of a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate slowly from the bathroom, seeping into the rest of the space. About 8 months after moving in, things took a stranger turn. Late one night, I was watching a movie on the sofa with the kitchen doorway just behind my right shoulder when I heard an odd tapping sound. It had a rhythm to it, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, almost like someone drumming fingers on wood in an impatient manner. I paused the movie, thinking, what the hell was that noise? Was it coming from the kitchen or the bathroom? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. The first and last taps seemed more pronounced, separated by moments of intense silence. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and turned on the light. Everything looked normal, though slightly cluttered, but I started searching for a possible source. A loose pipe, maybe a rodent. As I looked toward the sink, the tapping came again, this time from the refrigerator on my left. I turned slowly, scanning the fridge and the gap between it and the wall. Nothing unusual, just some ugly linoleum. Then, as if to taunt me, the tapping resumed, now coming from the baker's rack on the right side of the fridge. The toaster oven rattled in sync with the taps, as though something were intentionally playing with my nerves. I cautiously approached the baker's rack, opening a wooden drawer, hoping to find some logical explanation. When nothing appeared, I closed the drawer, placing my hand on the next one. Then the metal stovetop behind me echoed with that same rhythm, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Feeling like a character in a horror movie, I tiptoed toward the stove. There was a pan resting on it, but it was empty. The tea kettle held no answers either. Frustrated, I decided to leave the kitchen light on and go back to the living room. Just as I turned to leave, the metal sink behind me tapped out the rhythm once more, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Determined to find the source, I spun around, peering over the edge of the sink. That's when something used all its energy to kick the metal side of the stove. Bang! My second thought was, I think it wanted to frighten me. My first thought, however, was pure outrage. In an instant, my patience snapped, and I unleashed a tirade that would make a drill sergeant blush. How dare you? I began, verbally tearing into whatever was haunting me. I criticized it for choosing to haunt a decaying building in a rundown neighborhood, accused it of lacking dignity, and ordered it to leave immediately. I continued, hurling insults, mocking its ineffectual attempts to scare me, and casting aspersions on its moral character. I ended by making it clear that if it didn't leave, there would be consequences. To my surprise, it left. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the apartment felt lighter. Friends and family have told me that my anger can be terrifying, and it seems even supernatural entities weren't immune. About 2 months later, I was entering my darkened bedroom when I noticed a shadow on the shade of the door leading to the enclosed porch. It looked like the solid outline of a man, just under 6 feet tall, with a stocky build and wearing a pork pie hat. Given its position, the person casting it would have had to break in, unlock the bolts, and stand on the porch looking directly at the door. Annoyed, I used the slow, deliberate tone I reserve for the truly dim-witted. I explained this very clearly last time, I said, snapping up the blind. No one was there. Undeterred, I launched into another tirade, making it clear that banished included the porch, and that loitering outside the locked door was not permitted. I declared that it had the intelligence of a brick but none of its usefulness, and I commanded it to leave, even banishing it to hellfire in a fit of frustration. Reflecting now, maybe sending it to hell was overkill, but either it left or it wisely decided to stay hidden until I moved out 2 years later. In late 2006, I finished my time in the U.S. Army. I was young, eager to enjoy life outside the military, and looking forward to reconnecting with my family. I moved back to Massachusetts to be closer to them, and my mom suggested I stay with her until I found a steady job. At first, I wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but she mentioned that the 3rd floor of her house had been remodeled and would be a great fit.
In October 2006, I moved in. My brother and sister also lived on the 3rd floor, but that didn't bother me. I'd only been to the house once before, when my mom was moving in, and I remembered feeling slightly off about the place. Now, fully settled in, that feeling of unease persisted, though I brushed it off. The first strange incident happened in early November. I was shaving in the bathroom, and I lost track of time. When I finally finished and walked out, my brother gave me a scowl. An hour? I thought guys in the army were supposed to be quick, he joked. I laughed, but when I checked the clock, I realized it had actually been close to an hour. I was baffled but didn't think too hard about it. I was still very skeptical back then. The next incident occurred 3 nights later. It was around 10:30 p.m., and I was in the bathroom when I heard footsteps outside the door. I peered under the door and saw what looked like 2 shadows of legs standing there. My heart raced. No one was supposed to be home for a few more hours. I quickly opened the door, expecting to catch someone in the act, worried an intruder had entered my mom's house. Still skeptical, I assumed it was just a person. Who else could it be? Grabbing a bat, I systematically cleared every room. No one was there and all the doors were locked. I chalked it up to nerves, reminding myself that it was an old house and maybe I was just paranoid. Adjusting to civilian life had left me a bit on edge, so I let it slide. The following day, I was on the 2nd floor, where the main kitchen, dining room, living room, bathroom, and primary bedroom were located. My mom was gathering laundry and carrying it upstairs. Suddenly, my brother and I heard a loud slam. My mom came downstairs muttering, F**********, ing Carl. My brother looked confused and asked why she was swearing about him. Mom explained that as she had approached Carl's room, the door had slammed shut right in her face. Trying to be logical, I asked if she had left a window open, but she didn't know. My brother and I went up to check it out. We found Carl's room locked tight, with all the windows shut. Given that it was November in Massachusetts, of course, the windows were closed. I told everyone it was probably just a draft, hoping we'd move past it without dwelling too much. But in the days leading up to the first major event, our lives were plagued by shadows, knocks, and footsteps throughout the house. I kept insisting it was just an old house and coincidence, nothing more. By the 2nd week of December, things escalated. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to hear my brother shouting, no. He was saying he couldn't and wouldn't stay there anymore. I ran to check on him, and he assured me everything was not okay. He was packing his bags, grabbing only what he could carry. I helped him outside, and once we were in the yard, I asked him what had happened. At first, he resisted, saying I wouldn't believe him. I urged him to tell me anyway. He described hearing a rustling sound that had woken him up. Assuming it was our dog, Simba, he rolled over to shoo her away, but what he saw instead froze him in terror. He described a figure, like a naked person, rushing through the wall. Startled, he thought it was a bizarre hallucination, but then he saw something even worse. The figure was being chased by something monstrous. He described the pursuer as grotesque, something straight out of a horror movie, crab-walking grotesquely across the wall in pursuit. I suggested it might have been sleep paralysis, but he shook his head, insisting he'd fully woken up after seeing the first figure and saw the monster clearly. After that night, my brother refused to step foot back in the house. We ended up spending Christmas at my aunt's house, avoiding our own. A couple of days after Christmas, my mom and I were watching TV around 11:30 a.m. Something caught my attention, and I glanced at the doorway, seeing what looked like a figure, a person wearing a giant hat and a cloak. This person blocked out the sunlight and filled most of the doorway with its massive frame. I looked away for a moment, and when I looked back, it was gone. My mom immediately asked if I'd seen it too, and I nodded. I grabbed her pistol, asked her to lock the doors, and went through every floor, searching for any sign of a person. All the doors were locked and deadbolt, and I found nothing. When I returned, I asked my mom to draw what she'd seen, and I did the same. Our sketches were nearly identical. Shaken, we sat in the dining room, comparing notes, jotting down any distinguishing features we'd noticed. Every detail matched. Though I felt scared, I resolved to stand my ground. In the days that followed, the house felt even more oppressive. It was as though it was alive and actively trying to push me out. The constant footsteps, shadows, and knocks became relentless, echoing through all hours of the day. The atmosphere was suffocating, driving me to the edge. One night, I was lying in bed, facing my window. The streetlight outside usually illuminated my room well, but as I lay there, I started hearing faint whispers. As they grew louder, the light from the streetlight began to dim, retreating out of my room as if being absorbed. When it reached the window's edge, I heard a chilling whisper right by my ear. "Let's get him." Terrified, I sat up and yelled, telling whatever it was to leave. A loud crash erupted from within my room. I jumped out of bed, turned on the light, and saw a hole in my wall about 6 or 7 inches above my cable box. The hole was the size of a softball. That morning, I went to work and put in my 2 weeks' notice. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I returned only once, about 3 months later, when my mom was moving out after selling the house. Occasionally, when I visit my mom, I drive by the house, but even looking at it fills me with anxiety. Since my mom sold it, the house has changed hands twice. Interestingly, she later told me that when she replaced my room's carpet, she discovered a door beneath it, covered in hundreds of nails. She said it looked ominous. The house and events are real. Everything I've written here is accurate, and I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone.
It's been a while since I posted a story, and I've hesitated about sharing this one. Oddly enough, I have another story I haven't submitted because it sounds too strange to believe, even though my family swears it's true. I have a weird habit of writing out my experiences but not sharing them, though this one has been on my mind for the last month. I thought I'd share it here, as it came back to me when I described my parents' first American house to another user. When my parents moved, they bought a new single-level ranch home. It was a comfortable, calm place with a decent front lawn, and most importantly, my brother and I finally had our own rooms again after a stretch in a cramped apartment near Dad's work. The house was fairly normal, but a few things about it felt off. The basement had a steep staircase with open risers, which made me feel uneasy. There were only 2 small windows under the deck, and with the washer and dryer positioned against the far wall, it felt isolated and dim. I hated lugging laundry down the entire length of the house, through a U-turn in the kitchen, down the stairs, and then all the way across the basement just to reach the machines. On the positive side, the house had a large deck running along the back, with lovely views from the windows. But at dusk, I wasn't too fond of the view through the sliding doors, which looked across the deck and into the northeast corner of a field, where a decrepit, abandoned cottage stood. My brother and I had explored the cottage despite our parents' warnings, but it was unsettling. A decaying structure filled with the remnants of the previous inhabitants, slowly collapsing into its own basement. The house was built on the only habitable acre of an 8-acre meadow. The other 7 acres, including the area with the cottage and an abandoned concrete foundation downhill, had failed the state's percolation tests. Across the road, a 10-acre meadow sloped down to a marshland, drained by a brook that curved around our meadow's southern and western boundaries, flowing north in a quirky twist of Massachusetts topography. I mention all this to show that while the house was normal and the surroundings quiet and rural, I witnessed 3 inexplicable objects there. Each one seemed to follow its own strange physics, somehow interacting with the space as though in another dimension. The first encounter happened during the 2nd or 3rd summer we lived there. I'd been outside playing with our dogs and came inside for a drink. I climbed the deck stairs, went through the sliding doors, and poured myself a glass of juice in the kitchen. As I stood with my back against the cabinets, I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to look down at the floor. There, emerging through the kickplate under the cabinets, was a silver-gray cylinder about 4 or 5 inches long. It rotated slowly clockwise as it glided across the kitchen floor, then disappeared into the baseboard radiator on the opposite wall. The cylinder tapered at each end, resembling an old-fashioned fountain pen with a cap. It appeared completely solid, blocking the view of the linoleum beneath it, but what struck me was the color. It looked like swirling silver and gray, as if the colors were fluid, mixing within the object without regard to its movement. The fact that it passed through solid walls intrigued me, though I wondered why it didn't sink through the floor. If that had been a one-time thing, I'd have dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by dehydration. But the next encounter was even stranger. Sometime in autumn, probably the following year, I had a fight with my parents, well, mainly my mom, in the living room. I stormed off to my bedroom, slammed the door, and sat behind it, blocking entry. Still upset and fighting back tears, I suddenly noticed another silver-gray object, about the size of a sheet of paper, rising slowly near my desk. Initially, I thought slamming the door had dislodged a piece of homework, but this paper was clearly thicker and flapping as it floated upwards, as if on an invisible breeze. The object would curve downwards as it rose, then flatten and form a U shape before gaining momentum with each flap. I was transfixed. It reminded me of the cylinder I'd seen in the kitchen, and I wondered if it too would pass through walls or vanish. Just as that thought crossed my mind, the object popped out of existence mid-air at about 4 feet off the ground, like a soap bubble. I was disappointed that it vanished without a sound. And since I was still angry with my parents, I didn't exactly feel comfortable asking them to help me explain a flapping, levitating rectangle. Sometime later, I believe it was spring, though I don't recall this encounter as vividly as the other two, I was sitting in the living room, reading on the sofa. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a metallic sphere, like a floating silver balloon being carried by an invisible child. It drifted leisurely across my peripheral vision, and as I turned to look at it, my German shepherd suddenly barked once, right beside me. I glanced at the dog, who was watching the sphere too, but when I looked back, it had disappeared. I didn't know if it had popped, hidden, or simply vanished, but it was gone. These encounters happened about 25 years ago, and I've never seen anything like those quasi-solid, metallic objects since. They seemed to follow some rules of physics, but definitely not all. Each was a different shape, appeared at different times of year, moved in unique ways, and vanished differently, but all shared that swirling metallic appearance. My mind was in different states during each encounter, exhausted, furious, and preoccupied. And before anyone asks, I wasn't under the influence of anything. I actually take medication to keep my brain functioning normally, so drugs were never a temptation. I'd already had enough challenges staying grounded in reality. For what it's worth, I'm the youngest of 4 and left-handed, like my uncle, my mother's brother, who is also the youngest and left-handed. I heard somewhere that this is common, though I'm not sure if it means anything. Until I was 8, my family lived in Billerica, a town in northeastern Massachusetts. Once a farming community, it became filled with new neighborhoods as more land opened up for development. Our house, a 3-bedroom cape, was built in 1972, and we were the first owners. We lived just a few blocks from the Billerica Mall, up on a hill. My older brother and I shared the room over the kitchen, and my 2 older sisters shared the room over my parents' bedroom and the living room. The roof in front of the house sloped down to the first floor, so they built the upstairs bedroom closets into the slope. The closets had large wooden doors on swivel hinges, no handles, just push on one end, and they'd open. Many odd things happened in that house, from the strange clown face at the top of the stairs to the sight of our family dog walking down the stairs, even though he was actually chained up in his pen outside. First, the clown face. This was something my sister Jay noticed first, and while it might be explained by the 70s style paneling, it was eerie nonetheless. The face seemed to morph from a harmless, happy clown to a demonic grin, something sinister and unsettling. The hallway lights at the top of the stairs were never turned off, and if you shined a flashlight up there, it highlighted the features of that menacing face even more. Jay had a mischievous streak, so maybe she was feeding off our fears, but we all saw the face change, and there was something undeniably eerie about it. Though it never left the wall, a lot of activity happened in that hallway or nearby, and there was a frequent sense of unease there. I'm generally not clumsy, yet in that house, I was knocked down the stairs on at least 2 occasions, once hard enough to knock the wind out of me. Each time, I was convinced that one of my siblings had pushed me, only to find them already downstairs, nowhere near me. Jay, the oldest of my sisters, was the instigator, always twisting the truth just enough to see how we'd react. My brother B, the next in line, and my other sister P completed our group. Jay had a knack for causing mayhem, watching it unfold with a sly grin. On cold mornings, we'd race to the living room to sit on the heater vent. One particular morning, P got up first and crept downstairs quietly to avoid waking anyone. Sitting on the vent, enjoying the warmth, she saw our dog, Baron, walk down the stairs and head into the kitchen. She got up and followed him, confused when he didn't come over when she called. When she checked the kitchen, he was nowhere to be found. Then she glanced outside and saw him, securely chained in his pen. Dad had put him out there earlier before heading back to bed. Baron was alive and well, and he lived for many years after that incident. We sometimes wondered if it could have been my mom's previous dog, Raven, who had died a few years before P was born. Raven had appeared to my mom a few times, and we speculated she might have been checking in on B, who had known her best. P had another strange encounter when she woke up one morning to see a man sitting in a chair, watching her. She described him as wearing an old-fashioned, black and white striped uniform, almost like an old-time prisoner outfit. My brother B was the typical older brother, always teasing us younger ones. He and his friend N loved to mess with us, especially J, P, and me. One day, we were playing light as a feather, stiff as a board in J's closet, the darkest spot we could find. We had a candle lit, and it was my turn to lie down. They chanted, "Light as a feather, stiff as a board," and I relaxed so much I nearly drifted off. Suddenly, bang, bang, bang. We all screamed, and B rushed in, acting concerned, while we tearfully explained what happened, until we heard N laughing. It turned out he'd pounded on the stairwell wall to make it sound like it came from deep within the closet. B tried to hide his laughter but got a well-deserved kick from J. What happened next felt like retribution, but to this day, everyone denies responsibility. Somehow, J acquired a Ouija board. She doesn't remember where from. We began playing and J naturally took the lead. "Does anyone wish to make contact?" she asked. The board answered almost immediately, "Yes." J asked, "Who are you?" The board spelled out D red. She continued, "Who would you like to speak with?" It answered, "Walter." By now I was beyond scared. Between the prank from B and N and now this, it was too much. "What would you like to say?" J asked. The board spelled, "Die." At that point, I was in tears. "Why?" J pressed. The board replied, "Hate him." Even B, usually unfazed, was visibly shaken. He ended the session, and J sent D red away. His parting words, "We'll hurt him." J asked if anyone else wished to speak, to which I nervously added, "Only nice people." We connected with a young woman who wouldn't identify herself, leading to accusations of someone pushing the board. To prove her existence, J asked for a sign. The board replied, "Look next door." We all ran to my room, which faced the neighbor's house, and there, in the neighbor's doorway, was a young woman with long dark hair in a pure white dress. She vanished after a few seconds. We bolted downstairs, terrified, and huddled against the kitchen wall. That's when my nose began to bleed, the blood dripping rapidly. My brother grabbed a facecloth, which was soaked within seconds. We heard a loud thud from upstairs, and in that instant, my nose stopped bleeding, and the fear lifted. That's all for now, but there's more to tell. After the events with D red and the mysterious young woman in the white dress, c. strange occurrences in our Billerica house, J had had enough of the Ouija board and got rid of it. For me, though, things just got stranger. We had a 20-foot round above-ground pool, and I loved swimming in it, like a fish in water. I was always in that pool whenever I could be. One afternoon, I was alone, swimming laps underwater and coming up for air when I'd reached the wall. My siblings were off with friends, and my dad, who was technically watching me, was asleep in bed. My dad wasn't a bad man, but he drank a lot. Having learned he was adopted as an angry teenager, he felt abandoned and thrown away by his birth parents, which led him down a dark path of dealing with pain by drinking. I can't judge him for it. Unless you've experienced that kind of rejection, it's hard to understand. So there I was, doing laps, when I came up for air and saw two kids about my age. I was 6 at the time. It was the 70s, and back then, kids were left alone more often. They were standing near the pool, giggling, and when I asked who they were, they replied, "We're new here. Do you want to play?" Their voices sounded odd, almost like they were speaking through a fan, and there was something off about their faces. Puffy, but not exactly puffy. It's hard to describe. I swam closer and offered to play hide and seek or swim with them, my two favorite games. Just as I got within arm's reach, they grabbed my head and forced me underwater. I thrashed and struggled, trying to get free, until they suddenly let go. Gasping, I gripped the side of the pool, pulling myself up. When I looked back, The two kids were on the other side of the pool, laughing, and then, just like that, they vanished. Terrified, I made my way to the ladder, climbed out, and locked it in its safety position. Looking around the yard as I walked back into the house, I went straight to my room, sat on the floor, soaked and shaken, and started to cry. A while later, my brother came home and found me. When I told him what had happened, he just looked at me, eyes wide, and told me to try to forget it, assuring me I was probably just seeing things. I tried to move on, but I couldn't forget it. The next day, my mom took us to my grandparents' house in West Newton, where we had a great time. When we returned home later, we found the pool drained. I didn't ask, but I assumed my brother had told my dad what happened. The pool stayed closed after that. Soon after, my dad took an interest in mysticism, studying concepts like Che and something about an eye that I never quite understood. My sister P jokingly called it the evil eye. He tried teaching us meditation and awareness of energies, but we were too young to grasp it. To us, it just seemed like Dad had flipped. I tried to do what he said, though. One night, I lay in bed, trying to channel my Che as he'd instructed, when I heard the closet door creak open. Our room was divided by a 6-foot wall that Dad built for privacy, giving my brother the side closer to the hallway, while I had the outer wall with a window facing the neighbor's house. The closet was in the shared middle space between our beds. Startled, I glanced over and saw what looked like Swiss Miss and the Dutch boy advertising characters walking out of my closet. They both looked angry, glared down at me, then grabbed my pillow and held it over my face. I was screaming and flailing, trying to knock them away, feeling their arms like icy, squishy bags, until they suddenly vanished. Shaken, I ran downstairs to my dad, who sat me on his lap and handed me his beer to calm me down. We watched TV until I settled. Oddly, he never asked what had happened, almost as if he already knew. After that day, I'd occasionally hear breathing from under my bed when I was alone. Our dog was either outside in his pen or downstairs with everyone else, but I was alone in my room since my bedtime was earlier than my siblings. One morning, I woke with the window shade open, letting in the sunlight. Half asleep, I noticed a dark figure out of the corner of my eye. Assuming it was Jay, I asked her to close the shade, and after she did, I drifted back to sleep. Later, when I saw her eating breakfast, I thanked her for closing the shade. She looked at me, puzzled, and told me she'd just woken up. My sisters avoided our room after the young woman in the white dress incident, so Jay insisted it wasn't her, and my brother wouldn't have fit the shadow size. The closet was a source of torment for me. I had recurring nightmares of a man living in the wall between my closet and my brother's. He was always stoking a furnace, or what looked like a large, hot metal structure, his hands and face partly burned. In these dreams, I'd see him through a medium-sized hole in the wall, watching him as he worked. In another nightmare, we were getting ready to go out to dinner, a rare treat for us. I got ready quickly, and instead of going through the side door in the kitchen, I somehow walked outside through my closet, a feat, considering we were on the 2nd floor. The car was parked at the bottom of the hill, and as I approached it, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. I saw a light coming from the side door and looked up to see my brother yelling something I couldn't understand. Just as I turned back to the car, it lit up with a blinding, white-hot flame, and a twisted, contorted face appeared, grinning at me with malice. Frozen in terror, I couldn't wake myself up. Then, in the dream, my own face merged with the fiery face inside the car. I woke up, surrounded by flames in my crib, but it was another nightmare within the nightmare. I looked to the window and saw an unformed shape flying through it. Taking this as a cue, I jumped out, finally waking up on my bedroom floor with my arm throbbing from the fall and the smell of burnt matches lingering in the air. Years later, after my family splintered, my mom, her new husband, and I moved to Westboro, while my siblings stayed with my grandmother in West Newton. I met a girl in high school who read tarot cards, though she never claimed to be psychic. During a random conversation, she broke into tears and described my nightmare from years ago, saying it was a manifestation of D. Red. She warned me that although he was gone, he'd return when he grew stronger. I was both freaked out and inclined to believe her, as I'd never told anyone about that nightmare or read.
She offered me a tarot reading, and I silently asked if I'd attend Northeastern University. Keeping my question to myself, she started reading, but then paled and told me, "I don't know what you asked, but don't do it. If you follow that course, you'll be responsible for the fall of our civilization." I never set foot on Northeastern's campus after that. Ironically, my sister P attended Northeastern at the time, though I didn't connect the dots until later. Back in Billerica, that summer of '79, my parents' marriage was unraveling. On what seemed like an ordinary night, we suddenly heard my dad screaming in the dining room. Assuming he was yelling at Mom, we crept down the hall, only to find her with us, looking just as confused. We all stood in the doorway, watching as he shouted incoherently at the ceiling, holding a steak knife. Before anyone could react, he slit his wrist, blood spraying upward. Mom screamed for help, and our neighbor, N's mother, rushed over to take us kids to her house. We saw the ambulance arrive with police and fire trucks, and Mom went over to help. It took several people to restrain him, and they eventually managed to strap him down. We heard that as the ambulance drove away, he stopped fighting and simply cried. He never spoke of that night, nor did he ever return to his studies in mysticism. He passed away in 2012, found in a semi-catatonic state on his front porch, his health deteriorating within weeks. The official cause was acute liver failure, but I like to think he went down fighting. I'm named after him, so seeing my own name on his coffin was surreal. After that summer, things quieted down in Billerica, save for my recurring nightmares and the occasional corner-of-the-eye phenomena. My parents divorced, and we sold the house in '82. I sometimes check to see if the current or former residents have shared stories about the place, but so far I haven't heard anything. I thought I'd share a couple of strange occurrences I've experienced on the job. I work as a night watchman at a local dog track, covering the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I'm the only one here at night, and my job is to patrol this big, old building, inside and out, watching for trespassers, homeless folks, and even the occasional stray gambler hoping to hide out until morning. The track, with its multiple floors and history dating back to 1935, has plenty of space and stories hidden in its walls. During my 2 years here, I've heard plenty of odd noises. Working in a place this old, I usually chalk up strange sounds to the building settling or random outside noises. I'm not a jumpy person by nature and can ignore most of the thuds and creaks I hear throughout the night. But some things have happened that I just can't explain. One night, I was doing my rounds in the upstairs dance floor area. After unlocking the outer doors, I was still fumbling to put my ring of keys back in my pocket as I walked toward the pitch-black dance floor. My flashlight was still off, and then, right in front of me, a white light appeared. It was just 3 feet away, about the size of a nickel, glowing brightly and moving slowly through the air. I can't say if it was perfectly round. It happened so fast. It hovered at chest level for 2 seconds, then blinked out, leaving me stunned. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, whispering, "What the heck was that?" Or maybe something stronger. I stayed there for 5 or 6 minutes, waiting for the light to reappear, but it didn't. I tried to reason it away as a firefly, even though I knew it couldn't be. It was February in New England, 20 degrees outside, and that area is always sealed tight. With my heart racing, I knew I had to finish my round, even though every instinct told me to head back to the front desk. But, not wanting to explain a skipped round to my boss, I pushed forward. The rest of my patrol was uneventful, though the light remained on my mind. On another night, I was again walking through the empty dance floor area when I began to hear faint voices. The sound grew louder as I approached the bar. I hopped over the counter and crouched, listening closely. It sounded like a crowd, people talking, placing bets, along with the familiar hum of ticket machines. The words were too muffled to make out, but the whole thing was eerily clear. I started thinking maybe a TV had been left on somewhere below me, so after finishing my round, I headed downstairs to check. But when I got to the floor beneath, it was completely silent. No TVs, no machines running, nothing. Yet another time, I was doing my rounds in the clubhouse area around 2:30 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of a greyhound barking and howling. The echo filled the quiet building, startling me. I know there aren't any dogs in the track at night, so I walked down to the paddock area, where dogs would be held if there were any around. But as expected, there were no dogs in the cages. I can't imagine the sound came from outside either, since I was deep inside the building. A coworker of mine, who's been with the track for over 10 years, told me about an experience he had while working as the lure operator, running training races for the greyhounds. One day, while operating the lure, he thought he saw something strange on the backstretch. He glanced back and saw what looked like a pack of ghost dogs racing behind the real ones. At first, he panicked, thinking maybe some of the trainer's other dogs had escaped and gotten onto the track. But as the ghostly dogs reached the finish line, they vanished. I've known this guy for a decade. He's in his 50s and not one to make things up. When he told me about the ghost dogs, I shared my own experience of hearing barking and howling at night. He suggested it might be the spirits of the thousands of dogs that have raced and died here since 1935. Thinking about it, I have to agree with him.
When I was 7, I lived in Air, Massachusetts with my mom and her boyfriend, Frank. I was always a difficult child when it came to bedtime. I hated the dark and couldn't stand being alone in my room. So I'd lie awake listening to the TV downstairs until my mom and Frank went to bed. Mom would leave my door open just enough so I could see the light from the hallway and she could check on me without waking me. One night I was especially restless. My mom had just put me back in bed after one of my usual stalling routines, and I was trying to sleep but couldn't. I looked over at my door and saw a woman standing there. She was surrounded by a strange green light and held something in her hands. At first, I thought it was my mom. She looked exactly like her. I called out, expecting her to respond, but there was only silence. My heart started pounding, and I hid under the covers. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out, she was gone. Around the same time, I remember lying in bed one night, listening to the sounds of a movie my mom was watching downstairs. It was 13 Ghosts, though I didn't know that at the time. It would eventually become one of my favorite movies, but back then, I didn't know anything about it. As I lay there, I suddenly saw a little girl walk past my door and into the bathroom. I froze. I was an only child, and I knew my mom was downstairs. The hall light was on, so I could see her clearly as she passed. I later found out my mom believed in ghosts but hadn't told me, not wanting to scare me. When I was about 8 or 9, my older sister passed away from a heart attack. I missed her, but I'd come to terms with it. Around her birthday, I was lying in bed as usual, not quite asleep. I closed my eyes, letting my mind wander, when suddenly I had a vivid vision. I saw myself standing in a room filled with family, celebrating a birthday. There was a banner on the wall that said, "Happy Birthday," and my older sister was there. She came over and hugged me, and I wished her a happy birthday. She laughed, and the moment felt incredibly real. When I opened my eyes, I felt strangely peaceful yet confused. A few years later, I was living in Brookline, New Hampshire, with my mom and her soon-to-be husband, Josh. My mom was taking care of an elderly man who had suffered a stroke and couldn't live on his own. The house we were staying in had a tragic history. 2 of his daughters had taken their own lives there. My mom and I started experiencing odd things. She would hear dishes being washed by hand in the middle of the night, and she assumed it was me. She'd go upstairs to check, only to find no one there. One night, I saw an enormous spider crawl across the floor. It was the size of a frisbee, but when we searched, we found nothing. I never saw it again, but I remember that image vividly. The strange experiences seemed endless. So many unusual things have happened to me over the years. Now I'm almost 20 and identify as a pagan. I live in other homes that are haunted, and I've learned to work with spirits. I'm a medium, though I don't practice as often as I could. I love the spirits. They've become like friends to me. It might sound strange, but I can't sleep unless I feel like they're watching over me. When I stay at a friend's house without any spirits around, I feel restless and get an overwhelming urge to cry. Near my home, there's a place for yoga and meditation with hope in its name, though I won't reveal more than that. I've always believed it sits on a ley line, as it seems to emit a strange, powerful energy. One night, I went there with two friends. Let's call them J and C. C had recently lost his brother and was struggling with anger. I thought that walking the labyrinth and doing a small cleansing ritual might help him calm down. When we arrived, though, both J and C seemed immediately drawn to the woods just beyond the labyrinth. There was a strange, almost tangible darkness coming from the trees, and I wasn't eager to go, but they insisted. I agreed on the condition that C walk the labyrinth first. His emotions were raw, and with the dark energy looming, I felt he needed some sort of barrier. After a bit of resistance, he went through with it. Once C finished the labyrinth, we headed down a narrow path into the woods. Briars clung to our clothes, and the air was completely still. There were no sounds of wildlife, and the evening sun had dimmed into a quiet twilight. As we reached the end of the path, it split into a three-way fork, and without a word, J and C bolted off in opposite directions. I want to point out that we were all completely sober. I decided to follow J first. I found him a few yards into the woods, talking quietly with a tree. His eyes and voice seemed distant, almost hypnotized. He kept insisting that the tree was covered in eyes, and, despite admitting it felt demonic, said he had an intense need to hug it. I spent several minutes trying to convince him not to, warning him it was dangerous, but it wasn't until I mentioned that C had vanished that the trance finally broke, and he followed me back. Back at the clearing, J and I tried to find the path C had taken, but it seemed to have disappeared. We called out to him, but there was no response. Starting to panic, we retraced our steps up the main path and found a small side path that seemed to lead in his general direction. After several minutes, we finally found C standing completely still, staring silently through the branches of a tree toward a small brook. He didn't react when we walked up or even when we grabbed his shoulder, he just kept staring. As I struggled to get C's attention, J slipped into another trance, enchanted by a second demon tree, as he called it, again demanding that he hug it. I don't remember exactly how, but I managed to break C's trance, and together, we dragged J back up the path. C stayed stone-faced and silent the entire way, while J kept babbling about trees with eyes. When we made it back to the labyrinth, the sunlight reflected off something strange on C's back. A shadow, clinging to him like it was attached. Panicking, I told C to walk through the labyrinth one more time. This time, he didn't argue and went without a word. Once he'd finished, I quickly tossed a line of salt across the entrance, something I'd brought along for the cleansing ritual. As soon as I did, the shadow lifted from C's shoulder, but then we all heard loud banging sounds, like someone trying to break down a door, coming from the labyrinth. I rushed everyone back to the car, and as we drove, C finally spoke up, sharing what he'd experienced. He said that when he reached the fork in the path, he heard a voice calling to him. When he followed it, everything went silent, as if he'd entered a soundproof bubble. Then, when he reached the spot where J and I found him, he saw a shadowy figure crouching on a tree branch. He asked the figure, "Are you my brother?" The figure simply replied, "No." "Are you my anger?" Again, the answer was, "No." "Then who are you?" The figure paused and said, "I am you." Even though nearly 20 minutes had passed from when J and C split, it had felt like only a couple of minutes to C. 2 months later, J, C, his girlfriend T, and I were in a parking lot after seeing a movie, and the conversation drifted back to that night. T, annoyed that she hadn't known about the whole incident, asked when exactly it had happened. When I told her it was in mid-July, she paused, saying that she'd had a strange, demonic feeling around that time. She then asked for paper and a pen. To our surprise, T drew a rough but eerily accurate map of Hope and the wooded area beyond. She included details down to the nearly hidden stream, the fork in the path, and the stone heart at the labyrinth center. She even labeled the map as Hope and No Hope, with the names fittingly placed. The disturbing part was the X she marked on the map. T assumed it was the spot where C had been, but it was actually where I'd first found J. We've returned to that spot a few more times since. I guess we're gluttons for punishment, and although nothing as intense has happened, strange occurrences still do. For example, The stream remains completely soundproof, no matter what you throw in it, and we never hear any sounds of nature, not even the rustling of leaves. Whether it's because of T's map or despite it, it's always Jay who insists on going back. He says he's searching for something, though he doesn't know what it is. But we know that whatever he's looking for, he should never search for it alone. This is something that continues to happen in my life, and it all started years ago in Boston. We lived in a 2-story greenhouse, my mom, brother, and I on the first floor, and my uncle on the second. The house had a fireplace, though we never used it. One day, before heading across the street to a friend's house, I came across an old photograph of a girl who looked about 10 or 11. She had pale skin, beautiful hazel eyes, and wore a long white gown that reminded me of something from a Halloween costume, almost like a ghostly dress. She had no shoes on, and I can't quite recall the background, but her image stuck with me. When I went over to my friends, I showed the photo to her mom, wondering if she knew the girl. She went quiet for a moment, then told me that some time back, 2 girls had gone trick-or-treating one night and were kidnapped. She didn't know the girl personally, but she'd heard about it. After that day, I began to feel a strange sensation, like 2 hands resting on my shoulders. The hands didn't feel threatening. In fact, they felt oddly comforting. But then, one night while I was asleep, I heard a loud bang. I woke up my brother, who said it was probably just the dog. But the dog was asleep in our room. When the bang happened again, we got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the kitchen. A pan was on the floor, and a cabinet was open. We put the pan back and closed the cabinet. But as soon as we turned away, we heard it again. This time, we ran to our mom's room. She had heard the noise too. When she saw the pan and the open cabinet, she sighed, told us to come stay with her, and we all went back to her room. We sensed something was with us that night. It didn't feel dangerous, as the dog hadn't reacted, but it was unsettling. We kept hearing noises around the house until about 3 a.m. Over the years, even as we moved to different homes, I continued to feel those hands on my shoulders and hear strange sounds. But eventually, I began to see things too. When we moved to Florida, some friends and I were hanging out in an open hallway. Suddenly, one of my friends grabbed my shoulder and pointed at a nearby column. I looked over and saw a figure. A girl in the same white gown, but her face was unclear. We tried to approach, but the figure disappeared before we reached it. After that, my friends and I began to see the same girl in different places, both at school and even around our homes. A year later, we moved back to Boston. This time, my mom, stepdad, brother, and I ended up in a rundown apartment. In my room, I began to see a tall figure with long black hair, grayish skin, a white gown, and piercing blue eyes. She looked like a darker version of the girl with hazel eyes, almost like a shadow twin. Every night, I would see her only after dark. She made me feel uneasy, and when I saw her at school, she was smaller, more like the other girl. They seemed almost like twins. Over time, I began to feel 2 different sets of hands on my shoulders. At one point, I had a frightening encounter with the girl with black hair. I opened my eyes one night to find her in the corner of my room, her head resting on her knees. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping she'd vanish, but when I opened them, she was clearer and much closer, slowly walking toward me. I closed my eyes again, telling myself it was just a dream, but when I opened them, she was leaning over me, staring right into my eyes, her face only inches away. I bolted out of bed, ran down the stairs, and knocked frantically on my mom's door. I still felt an overwhelming sadness, and as I glanced back, I could see her shadow following me down the stairs. When my mom opened the door, the figure disappeared. I was in tears, and my mom let me sleep in her room. I ended up switching rooms that year. More recently, only a few months ago, I made a homemade Ouija board. I knew the risks, but I wanted to try contacting my great-grandmother. My godmother joined me, and we connected with a 15-year-old girl named Helen, who had passed from cancer. I asked her to protect me, and she agreed. That very day, the familiar sensation of the 2 hands on my shoulders vanished, only to be replaced by a much heavier presence. Since then, I feel as though I am surrounded by 3 distinct presences. One protects me, Another makes itself known, and the last seems to be reaching out for help. I still don't fully understand why the two girls, almost like twins, continue to follow me, but I know why Helen is here. I'm really not sure what I'm dealing with here. To start off, I live above my dad's workshop in a large studio apartment, just a few yards away from my parents' house. I moved into the studio when I started college, and that's when things started to get strange. At first, it was small things, objects being knocked over just after I'd turn off the light to go to sleep. I'd pull up the covers, settle in, and then hear something fall off the dresser. It wasn't just light things. It was heavier items like lotion bottles or boxes. Another time, I put in a DVD to watch before bed, then walked over to turn off the light by the door. The DVD had already started playing, so I climbed under the covers in the dark. It was one of those nights with no moonlight, so the room was pitch black. I remember distinctly thinking, I don't want to be in the dark. Almost immediately after I thought that, the TV shut off, plunging me into complete darkness. I was creeped out, but I tried to laugh it off, thinking, guess the ghost thinks it's bedtime. I checked to see if I had somehow sat on a remote or unplugged it, but there was nothing out of place. As time went on, the activity picked up. The most intense experience happened when my boyfriend and I were lying in bed watching a movie. Out of nowhere, a box of cookies that had been on the counter went flying across the room and skidded onto the floor. At the same time, something hit me in the back of the head. A crumpled piece of paper that definitely hadn't been crumpled before, and then the lights turned on by themselves. But the scariest moment happened in 2010 when my parents were on vacation, leaving me alone. My boyfriend didn't live with me yet, so I was by myself. I had gone out to a friend's house and locked all the doors before I left. When I returned around midnight, I pulled into the driveway and saw something that made my heart stop. The double doors in my studio were wide open. These doors are always locked and never opened because they don't lead anywhere. There's no staircase underneath them, just open air. I'd lived there for over a year and hadn't opened those doors once. Seeing them fully open, I immediately drove back to my friend's house, too scared to go inside alone. The next morning, I returned, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door to the workshop and someone had broken in. But when I checked, all the locks were still secure, and nothing was missing from the studio.
In winter, it gets too cold in the studio, so my boyfriend and I often sleep in the main house in a spare room. Last winter, we stayed there for almost 3 months. When we finally returned to the studio, it felt off. There was a sense of someone else in the room, almost hostile, like they'd claimed the space and didn't want to give it back. One night, as we were trying to fall asleep, we heard faint music coming from the workshop below us. But every time we focused on listening, it would stop, only to pick back up when we weren't paying attention. It was unsettling, to say the least. Whatever's in the studio, I feel like it's different from what's in my parents' house. Everyone in my family, including my boyfriend, has seen a dark, blurry shadow that moves from the bottom of the staircase into my parents' room. None of us know what it is, and it feels distinct from what I experience in the studio. The most recent incident happened a few weeks ago. My boyfriend was away, so I decided to sleep in the guest room in the main house. I don't like staying in the studio alone anymore. I woke up early to get ready for work around 5 a.m. and heard someone moving around in the library. Curious, I looked in and saw a dark figure shuffling around. I thought it was odd that someone else was up, but I didn't stare in case it was someone changing. My dad keeps some of his clothes there. Later, I asked my family who had been up that morning, but no one had. I still have no idea what I'm dealing with. Sometimes I get an intense, creepy feeling from these presences, but it's not constant. It feels like whatever's in the studio and my parents' house has a mind of its own. In 1972, my grandparents bought a house in South Attleboro, Massachusetts. According to records, the land had been owned by Peter Martinson and his wife, Anna, since 1890. Peter built the house in 1902, and it stayed in the family until their deaths, when it passed to their daughter, Dagmar. She sold the house in 1970 to another man, who eventually sold it to my grandparents 2 years later. The stories about the house start with my father and my Aunt Darlene. As teenagers, they were into heavy metal, and my aunt was interested in witchcraft. My father was mostly just a troublemaker. My aunt had a window in her room that led outside, and she believed it acted as a portal. She claimed she saw entities coming out of it. Later, when she moved out, my dad and his 3 brothers shared that room. My Uncle Billy, who was only about 5 at the time, started having night terrors, sleep paralysis, and would see terrifying things coming from that window. Another uncle, Kenny, would hear people talking upstairs, and on occasion, he'd hear the name Anna. His daughter Haley, when she was young, would often wake up screaming in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, especially when staying in that room. Whenever cousins would visit, they'd be afraid to sleep in that room. We all began to call it the boogeyman room. Years later, my dad, after his divorce, would stay in the house and sleep in that same room. He'd often wake up to find the TV on and his door closed, even though he was sure he'd left it open. He always suspected my grandfather had closed it, but my grandfather denied it. There was also a door at the bottom of the stairs leading up to that room, and when it was open, everyone in the house felt a strong sense of unease. But when it was closed, the house felt peaceful. On holidays like Christmas or Easter, my grandmother would open the door and invite Anna to join the family celebration. Whenever anyone in the house felt scared or uneasy, they'd simply call on Anna, and somehow, the fear would subside. Fast forward to 2013, my grandparents had been trying to sell the house for around 15 years without any success. The land was commercially zoned, but because it was marshland, no one wanted it. Finally, though, they managed to sell it. When my grandparents finished cleaning out the house, my grandmother looked up with teary eyes and said, "Goodbye, Martinson family. This is the last time you'll ever see us." She took one final picture of the house, and when she looked at it, she saw a figure of a man and a dog, who looked remarkably like my grandmother's dog, Annie, who was buried under the front steps, sitting on the roof. In the window of the boogeyman room, she could also see a man and a woman standing together. I still have that picture if anyone wants to see it. But there's more. My grandfather had been staying at the house every night to make sure it was safe from intruders while the sale paperwork went through. Then, one night, he decided he didn't want to drive all the way from Rehoboth to Attleboro and stayed home. That same night, a faulty wire, one that had been there for over 50 years, malfunctioned, and the house caught fire. It was the one night my grandfather wasn't there. The whole family, my parents, brothers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, gathered at the house as the fire department worked to put out the flames. My brother took a picture, and in it, a figure of a woman can be seen in one of the windows. I visited the next day to check out the damage. Every room was burned and blackened, except for the boogeyman room. It was untouched. Standing in that room, it felt like I was being watched, especially from a hole in the ceiling that led to the room. My girlfriend, who'd never been in the house before, was so unnerved she went straight back to the car.
As the sun began to set, I decided to go outside. But before I did, I went upstairs to look around one last time. The boogeyman room was still in perfect condition, with no sign of flames having reached it. I walked downstairs, stepped outside, and said, "Goodbye, everyone. You watched me grow up here, and now it's time to go." I took a final picture from the backyard. Later, as I looked through the photos, one image caught my eye, the one taken from the backyard. When I zoomed in on the back door window, I saw a woman standing there with a sad, almost motherly look, like someone watching their child leave for the first time. The house has since been torn down, and the land sold, but every time I drive by the empty lot, I feel a sense of peace. I think back on my childhood there. The 2 little boys who used to appear and play with me, the endless nights spent ghost hunting with my cousins, daring each other to stay a night in the boogeyman room. Our family believes the Martinson family is finally at rest. We think they became so attached to our family over those 40 years that they couldn't bear to leave us. We suspect Anna and Peter may have set the house on fire that night my grandfather wasn't there as a final farewell. And in my grandmother's last picture, it was as if they all came out to say goodbye. Peter, Anna, my grandmother's dog Annie, and another figure who might just have been Dagmar. I've had quite a few paranormal experiences over the years, most of them small, but some stick out more than others. This one is one of the more memorable ones. It's not the very first, but it's the earliest intense experience I can remember. I think it happened over a few months when I was around 11 or 12, sometime in 1998 or 1999. I believe it was summer because we were always staying up late. First, here's a bit of backstory. I live in Western Massachusetts, in the same house where I've lived my whole life. When I was younger, my best friend Lula, a nickname I'll use for her, lived right next door. Our houses were part of a duplex with thin walls, so we were always at each other's place. She moved in when I was around 7 or 8 and stayed until I was about 14, so from about 1994 or 1995 to 2001. Both of us believed in the paranormal. I guess we just didn't have much choice, given our experiences. Her room was the middle room upstairs, directly across from mine on the other side of the wall. The back room on her side didn't have a door, just a doorway. The light in her room would often go off on its own because of faulty wiring. It was just a lamp plugged into an outlet that was wired to a wall switch. We'd also end up alone in her house on weekends since her mom and her mom's boyfriend would sometimes go away, which we loved. One night, we were there alone, probably around 11 or 12 years old, just hanging out and listening to music in her room. Suddenly, the light went out and so did the music since the radio was plugged into the same outlet as the light. We didn't get too freaked out because it happened often. Usually, we'd just reach out into the stairway and jiggle the wire casing to get it to come back on. This time, though, we glanced into the back room and saw something. Standing in the doorway was a black, cloaked figure. It looked like someone wearing a hooded cloak, completely black, with no face and no eyes, almost like a person with a faceless mask. The figure began to slowly walk toward us. The energy it gave off felt heavy and negative, and we started screaming, terrified. After what felt like forever, the light came back on, and the figure was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in her room, but we grabbed flashlights and candles, just in case the light went out again. Over time, we would see this figure on other occasions, and it was always the same, an unsettling presence that never came past the doorway to the back room. One of the more unforgettable encounters happened when we weren't alone. I want to make it clear that this wasn't shadow play or anything in the room that could have created the illusion. It didn't show up every time the lights went out, and we even tried to debunk it by moving things around or recreating the lighting, but nothing explained what we saw. There didn't seem to be any specific pattern to when it appeared either. One night, Lula's niece was spending the night, and Lula's dog was with us in her room. The light went out, and there it was again, the black figure standing in the doorway. The dog began growling and barking while we all screamed. Yet strangely, no one ever came upstairs when we screamed, almost as if the room were soundproofed, even though there was no door on Lula's room. The last time I saw this figure was one night in my own room. I was asleep and woke up for no apparent reason. When I opened my eyes, there it was, standing in the center of my room, just watching. I remember pinching myself under the covers to make sure I was awake. I stared at it for a long time before eventually falling back asleep. Even though the figure felt negative, it never did anything beyond just existing in the space. I still don't know what it was or why it was there. After that last night in my room, I never saw it again. I've been experiencing what I call visits since I was 8 years old. I'll be 23 in a week, so it's been a long journey. I was born in Call, so my mother has always joked that I'm a witch, though according to myth, people born in Call supposedly have a deeper awareness and understanding of the world around us. I can't fully remember how it all started, but I know I was afraid to go to sleep by 2nd grade, and I eventually developed what you could call childhood insomnia. My parents even put me in counseling to help me cope. Looking back, I think the earliest vivid visitations started when I was around 11. They began with tall, shadowy figures that would simply watch me. Sometimes there were 3 at a time, though usually just 1. At that point, they didn't come close or make physical contact. I'd go long periods, sometimes up to 2 years, without seeing them. But then I went to college at 18, and things changed. They started coming closer. I don't know if it was because I was finally living on my own and they felt less restrained. But since then, the encounters have only gotten more intense. My first physical encounter happened when I was 20, living with my boyfriend in a small rental house. A lot of strange things happened in that house. One morning, we woke up to find a large, perfect circle of water in the center of the bed. There were no leaks in the roof and no logical explanation for it. We also frequently heard footsteps at night, doors would close by themselves, and the sink would occasionally fill itself with scalding hot water. The whole place felt oppressive. One morning, my boyfriend had left for an early class, and I woke up just enough to say goodbye, then drifted back to sleep. I often have vivid dreams where I'm fully aware of my surroundings, and this was one of those mornings. I saw everything in the room, but then, suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the corner. It was black and formless, almost like a person wearing a burqa but without any clear shape or features. I couldn't move, I was too scared. He came closer and sat at the foot of my bed, and I actually felt the weight of it as my foot sank into the mattress. That was the beginning of the physical encounters, and since then, they've become disturbingly frequent. I experience them at least 5 times a month now, and they only seem to intensify. About 2 months ago, things escalated further. This time, there were 3 shadowy figures watching me, and one approached the bed, grabbed my leg, and pulled it until I was lying straight. The fear has become so overwhelming that I can barely sleep. Even during the day, I catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision when I'm alone. I'm exhausted from so many sleepless nights and from waking up in tears. I know these experiences are often linked to sleep paralysis, but my research tells me that only about 3% of people experience it as frequently and intensely as I do. No one I've spoken to has had it last this long or reach this level of intensity. Then last night, something even stranger happened. I fell asleep quickly, which is rare for me. As I was drifting off, I felt a strange magnetic sensation on the back of my head and cheek, like my head and pillow were being pulled together. I woke up around 4:30 a.m. with that eerie feeling of being watched. When I looked across the room, there was a young man standing in front of my bookshelves, reading. He looked like he was in his early 20s and appeared so solid, so real, that I assumed he was an intruder. I was paralyzed with fear, barely able to whisper, "Hello." Finally, I managed to speak, and his eyes shifted toward me. I immediately reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on, but as soon as the light came on, he was gone. After he disappeared, a strange smell lingered in the room, and my legs, from the pelvis down, turned icy cold. It was a different kind of cold, not like touching something chilly, but a deeper sensation, like a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. The chair next to the shelves was also slightly moved. This visit felt so different from anything I'd experienced before. For the first time, the presence didn't feel threatening, but it still left me feeling thoroughly creeped out. I live in a very old apartment building in a college area, and I wonder if this could be the ghost of a past resident who might have died young. I'm considering doing some research to see if I can find out more about previous tenants. I've thought about trying a sage smudging to see if it might help with both the shadowy figures and this ghostly visitor. I'd love to know if anyone has had success with that approach. Even now, as I write this, I keep getting waves of tingles and chills across my body. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Growing up in the hill towns of western Massachusetts could be a lonely experience. The rolling green hills and dense woods of sugar maple, oak, and pine trees were stunning to look at, but farm life was demanding, filled with responsibilities and chores. Neighbors often lived half a mile or more apart, adding to the sense of isolation. In summer, storms would hit suddenly and with a fierce intensity. Lightning would flash across the dark sky, splitting in jagged streaks as it sought out water sources on or under the ground. Bolts would strike in rapid succession, followed by an earth-shaking, ear-splitting thunder that seemed to come from deep within the mountains. Over centuries, my family had cleared the mountainous land, and we knew that beneath the rocky ledges lay large veins of pure, clear water, a powerful draw for those lightning strikes. One particular day, I came in from the garden with a basket full of vegetables, planning a fresh salad and some summer squash. Since my mom's passing, I had taken over as the chief cook and bottle washer for the family. I'd had my fair share of kitchen disasters, but I'd learned from them, and it felt good to see my dad smile with pride when he came in to see supper cooking. I stood at the sink, washing the garden dirt off our meal under the icy spring water, focused entirely on my task. Then something happened that's difficult to explain. Suddenly, I heard a deep, vibrant voice in my mind. A voice so strong and forceful that it terrified me. It was as if it were coming from inside my own head, yet I hadn't heard it with my ears. The words were simple but urgent. "Back, girl, back." Without thinking, I jumped back, stumbling into a nearby chair. At that very moment, a bright, glowing ball of lightning burst from the kitchen faucet and struck the electric stove burner only a few feet away. Just a second earlier, I had been standing right in the path of that fiery lightning, with my hands in the running water. Did you know lightning has a smell? It left a sharp, almost metallic odor in the air, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My head ached terribly afterward, and I couldn't shake the shock of it. How could I hear a voice so clearly in my mind yet not with my ears? How could that happen? The stove burner had been heating water for my dad's tea, and the lightning must have been drawn to the closest electrical source. We had to replace the burner, and eventually, my tears dried, but the memory of that voice lingered, haunting me. The way it spoke was odd, as if English were difficult to pronounce, with the words almost growled out in a strange tone. It's hard to describe. Little did I know, I would hear that same voice 2 more times in my life, and both times it saved me from death once again. Now, I'll tell you about the second time I heard that same unearthly, thunderous voice. After the tremendous fear I felt the first time I heard that deep, booming voice, I found myself unable to speak of it, not even to my dad. I tried to push it out of my mind. Little did I know that I'd hear it again only about 6 months later. Winters in the hills were often unbearable, but our large farm kitchen stayed warm, thanks to an old wood stove. It made the kitchen cozy, with boots and shoes set beneath it, and a rack screwed into the wall for drying gloves and socks. But just a few steps down the hall, the temperature would drop sharply, the furnace unable to fight off the relentless New England winds. I was lucky to have our farm dog, Shadow, share my room at night, her warmth by my side. By day, she was my dad's loyal companion, but by night, she was my trusty guard. On this particular night, Shadow lay beside me, deep in sleep. The house was silent, and my dad was asleep across the hall, just around the corner. Suddenly, I jolted upright, sitting up with my eyes watering. Not again. The same loud voice echoed in my mind, fierce and urgent. "Fire, girl, fire." I shuddered, my heart pounding. Leaning out my bedroom door, I looked down the hallway toward the kitchen, where our wood stove was burning hot, overfilled with the hardwood my dad had gathered earlier that fall. A red glow surrounded the stovepipe, and small yellow-orange flames were beginning to catch the paneling on the kitchen wall. I shouted, "Dad, wake up! Get up!" It took a moment to rouse him, but once he was awake, he moved with incredible speed. We both rushed into action. He threw open cupboards, grabbing pans, and hurriedly barked out instructions as I tried to help, carrying water from the sink. The cold water splashed onto the wood floor beneath the stove, and slowly, the fire receded. The immediate danger was under control.
Taking one last pan of water, my dad flew up the stairs 2 at a time, just to be safe, soaking the hardwood floor near the chimney in the unfinished, empty rooms upstairs. After he was sure it was secure, he ran back down to the kitchen, opening the metal door at the base of the chimney to check. Small chunks of glowing creosote, which had built up over time, floated down, still smoldering. Afterward, we sat at the kitchen table, both of us calming down over a cup of tea. My dad looked at me and asked, "What made you wake up? How did you know?" I shrugged, avoiding his gaze, and replied, "I don't know. I just did." I knew I couldn't speak of that strange, powerful voice, the frightening but life-saving communication I had somehow developed with this mysterious presence. By my teenage years, I was growing older and had started dating. This was also the only time I didn't get along with my dad. My mother's early passing, combined with his lack of understanding, created constant friction between us. It was the mid-1960s, a time of change for everyone. My world had shifted to music, boys, and the Beatles and the Beach Boys, but life on an active farm meant more responsibilities and chores than most other kids had to deal with. One of my least favorite chores was fetching the cows. Our farm depended partly on the income from milking, so each morning, after milking, the cows were let out to graze in a large, open pasture across the road, bordered by woods. By late afternoon, it was my job to bring them back. I'd open the big gate and slowly herd them across the road and up the path to the barn, where my dad would be waiting to guide each cow into its stall. With about 40 cows, it was no easy job, especially alone. And with milking cows, slowly was the key word. They couldn't run, or their milk would leak, and they'd be upset for hours. One particular day, as I walked toward the gate, I noticed a storm brewing in the western sky. My mind was on the date I had planned later, and I was running my fingers through my freshly washed hair, hoping I wouldn't end up smelling like cow. I hated this chore, and it was so repetitive. At the gate, I could see the cows were crowded together, looking jumpy. I pulled the heavy wooden gate open, and instead of their usual slow exit, they burst out, running. Then, after years of silence, that deep, booming voice returned to my mind, louder than I remembered. "Run, girl, run." The words had barely registered when a deafening crack split the air right behind me, inches away. Without a second thought, I ran, and so did the cows, thundering forward like a wild herd. I could barely keep up, my breath gone, and ended up leaning on the oldest, slowest cow, unable to run as fast because of her age. All I could think about was how mad my dad would be. Oh, poor me, I thought, still selfishly focused on the trouble I was sure to get into. I braided my hair as I walked back in the rain to the gate, wanting to see what had happened. That one strike of lightning had hit the tallest pine tree by the gate, splitting it clean down the middle. Half of the massive trunk was buried in the dirt, exactly where the cows and I had just passed. If I hadn't moved, both I and some of the cows would have been killed. I sat on a wet rock near the fallen tree, taking a moment to pray and give thanks. That was the last time I heard that mysterious voice. What or who created it, I still don't know. Did it come from some deep, primitive place in my mind? Was it a guardian? And did I lose this connection as I grew older? If so, where had it come from? My grandmother was Native American from my mother's side. Perhaps I inherited something, some gift from her? Around 1955, I started seeing a boy on the playground, though I never saw him in class. He was short and a bit chubby, always in the same worn-out shirt, with a small spot where the stitching had come undone. His pants, once brown, were now faded and torn at the knees. The shirt was a bit too small, so when he moved, his belly would peek out. He laughed loudly and darted around, weaving through the bigger boys, trying to reach the ball. I found him entertaining, and his joyful spirit made me laugh, though I noticed that I seemed to be the only one laughing. I'd sit on the sidelines with a group of girls, watching him as he rolled in the grass and tried to join the games. One day, he ran over to us and plopped down right beside me. He had a bright, freckled smile, with short red hair in a butch cut. Smiling, I handed him a cookie from my lunchbox, one of the cookies my mom had made. I remember his smile, but I can't recall what either of us said.
What I do remember, though, is the aftermath. The other kids started laughing at me, and soon I found myself crying uncontrollably. Over the next few days, it got worse. My classmates began moving their desks an inch away from mine on all sides so the teacher wouldn't notice, but I certainly did. I had become the girl who saw things that weren't there, the one they teased and picked on. On the small yellow school bus, no one would sit next to me, even though it was overcrowded with students from all grades. It felt as though I were invisible, or as if I smelled bad or looked strange. The boy disappeared, and I didn't see him again. Each day I came home red-faced and teary. I clung to the hope that things would change by fall. Summers in our little hilly farm town meant swimming lessons at a small lake that was the heart of our community. The town had grown around this pond, which would shrink when the rains were sparse and the springs feeding it slowed. When the water level dropped too low, they'd close the diving board, posting a large closed sign on the dock to keep kids from diving into the shallow water. I always looked longingly at that diving board, eager for the day my swimming skills would advance enough to use it. Swimming lessons provided a welcome break from the summer heat, not just for us kids, but for our moms too. They'd sit nearby on towels, cutting string beans or prepping vegetables from the garden, keeping an eye on us. One summer day, I stood beside my mom, drying off with a towel and dripping everywhere. I happened to look at the diving board, and there he was, the boy. I waved to him, and he waved back with a big smile, then turned and dove headfirst into the water. My heart sank. "No, the water is too shallow," I shouted, but he was gone. I never saw him again after that. As an adult, I did some research looking for any story that could explain who he was. The only thing I found was a tragedy from the 1940s. A young boy had drowned while swimming alone and was found later. It makes me wonder, had he been reaching out for a friend all those years? After sharing events from my childhood, I thought I'd move forward about 40 years to tell you about an experience I had with an old antique. By 2003, my husband and I were empty nesters, and all of our parents were gone. I had recently been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and left my job to rest in preparation for treatments. It was an emotionally difficult time. Since I'd been introduced to computers years ago at work, I decided to buy a good desktop for our home. Eventually, I became a seller on eBay and spent the next 2 years doing that. A woman in town, a massive collector of small antiques, passed away, and her collection was put up for auction. As my husband looked on in shock, I kept raising my hand, bidding on one item after another. He dutifully carried each one home, storing them in the basement. At first, he shook his head, but once I started making a small profit, he warmed up to the idea. Before long, we were going to auctions regularly. It was fun for a while. One day, I paid $5 for a tray. It was huge, heavy, and so blackened with age and grime that you could barely make out the details. It had a fluted edge, was about 33 inches in diameter, and seemed handcrafted, definitely not made in the USA. It sat on an odd little table, sold separately, and I remember having a strange feeling about it, an uneasy sensation. My husband, shaking his head, hauled it home and leaned it against the furnace in the basement. That night, I knew I'd made a mistake. I had bought several items at the auction, but something about this tray felt wrong. Our home had forced hot air, but it was July, so we hadn't been using any heat. Yet, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a ping coming from the pipes in the basement. Over the next few nights, the sound grew louder and began happening during the day as well. I could hear it in all the heat grates. Whenever I went to the basement, the tray seemed to hum with a low, almost musical chant, making me uneasy every time I looked at it. I started to dread touching it and knew it had to go. But first, I needed to figure out what it was. I started researching online and in books, even went to the library, but I found no information on this type of tray. I began to suspect it had some sort of religious significance, but to whom or what, I had no idea. One night in early September, I was awake, sick from the treatments and tired of eBay. The hum from the tray felt louder, and when I looked, a shadowy figure stood in my bedroom doorway. My fear spiked as I sat up, straining to see. The figure was tall, thin, and moved side to side, humming that same chant. Terrified, I mustered up the strength to shout, "You go!" The shadow faded as my husband jolted awake beside me. The next morning, I had my husband take the tray to his workshop table in the basement. I poured cleaner on it and started rubbing. Beneath the grime, I could see it was brass, hand-hammered, with intricate enamel tiles in deep blues, reds, and greens, all set in thick rolled wire. As I cleaned, the beauty of the piece emerged, and a pile of dirty rags and paper towels grew on the floor. My husband, now intrigued, took over the cleaning, bringing out the vibrant colors and intricate details. When I came downstairs later, the shadowy figure was hovering just behind him, watching intently. I said nothing. My husband rarely saw or sensed things the way I did. The next day, I photographed the tray and listed it on eBay for $799, though part of me thought it could be worth even more, given the amount of gold in it. Within hours, a man contacted me, eager to buy it outright. He asked me to end the listing immediately, and as we messaged back and forth, I got up to make coffee. When I returned to my office, I saw the shadowy figure sitting in my chair, leaning forward to look at the computer screen. The buyer was unwilling to tell me where he was from or what the tray meant. He only mentioned that his son in New Jersey would handle the shipping. When I pressed for details, he responded, "It means much to me and nothing to you. It must come home." I didn't argue with that. Once the payment came through, we double-packed the tray, insured it, and shipped it to New Jersey. The shadow in our home disappeared. Gone. So my question to you is this. Was the shadow real? Was it a product of my mind, clouded by illness and treatments? Or maybe it was just my imagination. I swear everything I'm writing here is 100% true. And in one case, I have another witness who would back all of this up. This all happened in a small town near Boston, Massachusetts, in my mother's house. It's about 30 years old, and we were the first owners. The land used to be an apple orchard, and before that it was just woods. While it sounds quaint, many bad and stressful things have happened in that house over the years. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, I was at home with my mom. I walked into the bathroom, and as soon as I entered, I heard a low growl directly behind me. Note: we don't own a dog. I screamed, and my mom came running. I told her what I'd heard, and we looked around, trying to find some kind of explanation. Eventually, we found a vacuum extension near the bathroom door, and she suggested it might have tipped over and dragged against the wall, making the growling sound. I had my doubts, but for the sake of my sanity, I agreed with her and tried to forget about it. About 6 months later, my fiancé and I went hiking. We got lost in the woods and were eventually picked up by a really nice woman. She was a devout Catholic, and her car was filled with religious items. When she brought us back to our car, she handed me a statue of the child Jesus with a lamb, saying she'd picked it up at a yard sale but felt I was supposed to have it. Although I'm not religious, I was touched by her kindness and brought the statue home, setting it in the kitchen bay window. The next day, around dinner time, my mom and I were in the kitchen, having a pleasant, everyday conversation. We were just chatting about our day when, out of nowhere, we both heard a loud, menacing growl. It came from right in the air between us, sounding exactly like an angry dog. We started searching frantically for the source, opening cabinets, checking pipes, and running water to see if it might be something mechanical. But we found nothing, and we were both thoroughly spooked. Again, we don't have a dog, and she lives far from the road, so it wasn't a dog outside. The only logical explanation I can come up with is maybe something to do with water pipes, but if anyone has ideas, I'd love to hear them. This memory terrifies me, and I'd really like a normal explanation for it. My mom, thoroughly creeped out by the statue, told me to get rid of it. She thought it might somehow be responsible for the sound, so I took it outside. I was eager to blame the statue too, though my sister, ever the skeptic, laughed at us the whole time. Later, my sister came to me and mentioned that after a trip to Ireland, she'd brought home a small stained glass window of the Virgin Mary, which she'd hung in her room. She admitted that she'd started having bad nightmares and that the sight of it creeped her out so much she put it away. Interestingly, her nightmares stopped afterward. My sister suggested that maybe instead of a growling spirit being attached to the statue, it had disturbed something that was already in the house. That comment made me think back to the growl I'd heard that winter. I promise that everything I've described is true. My mom and I are both mentally stable. We don't drink, don't do drugs, and we're not religious or particularly drawn to the paranormal. We don't jump to paranormal explanations, but the creepy things that happen in her house have made me more open to the possibility. Being someone who's extremely afraid of anything paranormal, this experience gave me chills. At the time, I was 12, and it was the middle of July 2014. My dad was at work, my mom was out shopping, and my younger sister was down the street playing with our neighbors. I called my best friend, eager to see her since she'd just returned from a week-long trip to New Jersey. Not talking for a whole week was rare for us. We were practically inseparable, so this felt like forever. She agreed right away, saying her dad would drop her off shortly. A little while later, she arrived. We hugged instantly and ran inside, locking the door behind us. We spent the next 7 or 8 hours hanging out, catching up and fooling around. By the time we were setting up for bed, my friend went upstairs to brush her teeth. By then, my sister had come home and was fast asleep, and my mom had gone out with friends after checking in on us and making dinner. It was a Saturday night, and I knew my dad would be home from work soon. I didn't think much of it. My mom rarely got to go out between work and taking care of us, so I thought it'd be good for her to have a night out. Plus, it meant my friend and I had the house to ourselves, aside from my sleeping sister. While I was downstairs, my friend called out to me from upstairs, "Sir, can you come up for a minute?" I called back, "Sure, I'll be right up," and dashed toward the stairs. When I reached the hall and looked into the bathroom, it was empty. Usually, she'd have her toothbrush, makeup, hairbrush, and other essentials spread out, but there was nothing. I thought it was strange but shrugged it off, figuring she might have forgotten to unpack or had already put everything away. I decided to check in on my sister, as she occasionally sleepwalked or had nightmares. She looked like she was in a deep sleep, which was unusual because she was such a light sleeper that she'd often wake as soon as I stepped on the creaky floorboard in her doorway. Again, I brushed it off, thinking she just hadn't slept well the night before. Then I continued searching upstairs for my friend, assuming she might be in my room, as that was the only other place she'd usually be, besides my parents' room, though I knew she wouldn't go in there. I checked my room and found it empty. No friend. No bag. I was confused. Just as I was about to check my parents' room, the front door downstairs opened, and I heard my friend calling, Sir. I took Baxter out for you. Baxter is my dog, in case you're wondering." I froze. Dumbfounded, I ran downstairs to see her taking Baxter off his leash, removing her coat and shoes. "What do you mean? He didn't need to go out. And how did you get downstairs so fast without me noticing?" I asked in a rush. She looked at me, puzzled. "Huh? What are you talking about? You just asked me to take him out," she replied. I raised an eyebrow. "That's not possible," I said. "You were just upstairs, and I was up there looking for you." Her face shifted from confusion to concern. Sir, I was never upstairs. I haven't even gone up there once," she insisted. "Then why did you think I asked you to take him out if I was upstairs looking for you?" I asked, my heart racing. "Because you were standing right in front of me, asking," she replied, clearly unsettled. I asked her to be serious with me, wondering if she and my sister were playing some kind of prank. She told me my sister had been downstairs the whole time, on the computer. I ran down to check and, sure enough, found my sister on the computer, completely oblivious. Then I dashed back upstairs, only to see her bed perfectly made, as if she'd never been there. At this point, I felt on the verge of a panic attack. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my mind. My parents came home soon after, and we explained everything to them. They checked the house to make sure no one else could have gotten in, but found nothing unusual. We eventually went to bed, but that night I had a strange dream. I heard someone calling my name just like my best friend had earlier, and it felt like I was reliving the whole experience, as if in a lucid dream that was replaying the events of the day. I woke up in a panic, seeing my sister and best friend sleeping peacefully in my room. I nudged my friend awake, asking if she'd called my name, but she said she'd been asleep the whole time. I still don't know what to make of that day. I felt like I couldn't be sure what was real and what wasn't, but I know for sure it left me feeling shaken.